The day Gideon Crow walked onto Blackridge Ranch, he didn't knock. He drove his black buggy straight through the gate like he owned the place because in his mind, he already did. He stepped down onto the mud, smoothed his coat, and told Wade Mercer that the mortgage was being called. Not extended, not renegotiated. Called effective 30 days from that morning. Wade stood in the doorway of his own house and said, "You can't do that." Crow smiled the way a man smiles when he knows you have nowhere to go. "Read the contract," he said. Then he climbed back into his buggy and left without looking back. Inside the house, 4 children heard everything. None of them said a word. If that happened to your family, if someone walked into your home and told you that everything you'd worked for was about to disappear, what would you do? This is a story about a woman who had nothing when she arrived. No land. No history here. No claim on anything. But when someone tried to take what belonged to the people she had chosen to love, she didn't step aside. She fought. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe to the channel and follow this story all the way to the end because what happens next will stay with you. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled now. Let's begin. The letter had taken 11 days to reach Mara Whitlock in Cincinnati, which meant she had 11 days less than she thought to decide what to do with the rest of her life. She read it twice at the kitchen table of the boarding house where she'd lived for 3 years, paying rent on time every month by taking in mending and alterations for the women in the better neighborhoods across town. The letter was written in plain, careful handwriting, not flowery, not trying to impress her. It said that the writer's name was Wade Mercer, that he ran a cattle ranch in a place called Blackridge in the Northern Territories, that he had 4 children, that their mother had passed 14 months ago, that he needed a wife who wasn't afraid of hard work and wasn't looking for anything glamorous. That last line was the one that made her read it a third time. Not looking for anything glamorous. Mara was 26 years old. She had been engaged once to a man named Thomas Elias, who sold hardware and had a pleasant enough face and whose family had made it quietly clear after 2 years that they expected Thomas to find someone with better prospects, meaning a father with money, and a mother who didn't take in other people's mending. Thomas had let it happen without much of a fight. That told her everything she needed to know, and she'd packed what little she felt belonged to her and moved into the boarding house within a week. She was not romantic about her situation. She understood it clearly, the way women in her position always had to. She had limited options, limited money, and a limited window before the options got fewer still. The agency that had forwarded her Wade Mercer's letter charged $3 for the introduction and made it plain that a match like this, a rancher with property, no criminal history, and 4 children who needed care, was considered favorable. Some of the women at the agency wept when they read their letters. Mara did not weep. She counted her savings, which came to $12.40, and she wrote back. She told him she was not afraid of hard work, that she had no illusions about what she was agreeing to, that she would come and see the situation herself before any formal arrangement was made, and if either of them found it unsuitable, they would part without bitterness. He wrote back in 4 days, which was faster than she expected. He said that was fair. The train ride took 2 days and 1 night, and Mara spent most of it watching the landscape change outside the window, city buildings giving way to flat farmland, farmland giving way to open country that seemed to go on without apology in every direction. She had 1 trunk. It contained 2 dresses, her sewing kit, a pair of boots she'd resoled herself twice, 3 books she could not bring herself to leave behind, and the letter from Wade Mercer folded into the front pocket of her traveling coat where she could reach it without opening her bag. She wasn't sure why she kept it close. Maybe because it was the only thing in that coat pocket that belonged to the life she was going toward instead of the one she was leaving. The station at Blackridge was a single wooden platform with a hand-painted sign that looked like it had been rained on more than once. A man was waiting beside a wagon, not Wade Mercer, she learned later, but his nearest neighbor, a rancher named Holt Duggan, who'd agreed to bring her out to the property because Wade couldn't leave the cattle 2 days running. Duggan was a big, quiet man with a gray beard who said maybe 4 words during the entire ride and didn't seem bothered by the silence, which suited Mara fine. She was looking at the land. It was November. The grass was dead and the sky was the color of old pewter, and the road they took was rutted hard from recent rain that had since frozen in the grooves. They passed 2 other properties, one with smoke coming from the chimney, one that looked abandoned. Then they went over a low rise, and she saw Blackridge Ranch for the first time. She had imagined something middling. A decent house, a working barn, the ordinary disorder of a place running without a woman's hand for over a year. She had prepared herself for some degree of mess. She had not prepared for this. The fence line along the front of the property was down in 2 places. The gate was propped open with a piece of firewood. The house itself was standing, but one of the shutters on the upper window had come loose and was hanging at an angle, and the porch board she could see from the wagon looked soft and uneven, like they'd been wet too many times. There was a lean-to addition on the north side of the house that had partially separated from the main structure, and now jutted out at a slight angle, held together by what appeared to be optimism. Duggan stopped the wagon in front of the porch and said, "Here you are," and that was that. Mara climbed down herself, for he thought to help her, picked up her own trunk, and carried it to the porch steps. The door opened before she could knock. The girl who opened it was maybe 14, possibly 15, it was hard to tell, because she had a face that had been making adult calculations for long enough that it had settled into a kind of careful blankness, the expression of someone who had learned to read a room before entering it. She was wearing an apron that had been washed so many times the original color was gone. Her hair was pulled back in a practical knot. She looked at Mara the way a person looks at a weather system moving in from the west, not with hope or hostility, but with the fixed assessment of someone figuring out what they'll need to do to get through it. "You're the woman from Cincinnati," she said. "I am," Marcia said. Mara Whitlock. "You're Cecily. I'm the oldest." A pause. "My father's in the barn. He said to bring you inside and put on water." Mara picked up her trunk and followed her in. The inside of the house was warmer than she expected and cleaner than the outside suggested, which told her something about Cecily immediately. The girl had been working. You could see it. The dishes were washed and stacked. The floor had been swept. The kitchen table was clear. But there were limits to what one person could do, and those limits were visible too. There were cracks in the plaster that hadn't been filled. The curtains in the front room were torn at the bottom. A bucket sat in the corner of the kitchen, and Mara understood without asking that the roof leaked somewhere directly above it. 2 younger children were sitting at the kitchen table. A boy who looked about 10 watching her with open curiosity. A girl maybe 8 who was drawing something on a piece of paper and didn't look up when Mara came in. "That's Eli," Cecily said, nodding at the boy, "and that's Pearl." Eli stuck out his hand, with the seriousness of someone who'd been taught manners and intended to use them. "How do," he said. "How do, Eli," Mara said, and shook it. She looked around. "You said 4 children. Cecily's expression shifted, something too controlled to call a flinch. "Jasper's upstairs," she said. "He doesn't always come down." Mara didn't press it, not yet. She set her trunk by the wall and sat down at the table and accepted the cup of water Cecily poured for her and looked at Eli, who was still watching her. "What do you raise out here?" she asked him. He blinked like he hadn't expected to be asked anything. "Cattle, mostly. Some chickens. We had a milk cow, but she got sick in the spring." He thought about it. "Papa tries," he said it simply, without defensiveness, the way children sometimes say things that adults have carefully avoided saying, just the fact of it, clean and without ornament. Mara nodded. "I'm sure he does," she said. Wade Mercer came in from the barn 20 minutes later, and the first thing Mara noticed was that he was younger than she'd pictured, somewhere around 32 or 33, with a lean face and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in at least 4 days, and hands that were chapped to rawness from work and cold. He was not handsome in any arrangement-letter way, but he had the kind of face that might have been open once and had since closed up from weather and grief and the effort of carrying things alone. He took off his hat when he came inside. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Not a question, Mr. Mercer." She stood. He looked at her with the same directness she'd appreciated. In the letter, no performance. No attempt to seem better than the situation warranted. "I expect you've seen the place," he said. "I have. It looks worse than it is." She considered that. "The fence is down," she said, "and one of those porch boards will go through if someone steps on it wrong. And there's something leaking above your kitchen." He was quiet for a moment. "It looks about like it is," he admitted. Something about that answer made her decide she could work with this man. Not warmth, she wasn't looking for warmth yet, just honesty. A man who'd admit the truth when someone held it up in front of him was a man you could at least have a straight conversation with. "Your children seem to be managing," she said. "Cecily manages," he said. "The others follow her lead." He set his hat on the hook by the door and moved toward the stove. "She's done more than she should have had to." That was all he said about it, but it was enough. Dinner that night was a lesson in the texture of a household in survival mode. Cecily had made a pot of beans with salt pork and cornbread, and she did it efficiently and without a word of complaint, and she served her siblings and her father, and then sat down and ate whatever was left, which wasn't much. Eli ate with the focused urgency of a boy who'd learned not to leave anything on his plate. Pearl ate slowly, still not talking, her eyes on her drawing, which she'd brought to the table, even though Cecily gave her a look about it. Wade ate, standing up for the first part of the meal, then seemed to remember there was company and sat down. The 4th child, Jasper, did not appear. When the dishes were done, Mara helped without being asked, which earned her a sideways glance from Cecily that wasn't quite approval, but wasn't resistance either. She asked if she could see the rest of the house. Wade showed her. 4 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms, a narrow storage room, and a small room at the end of the hall where the door was pulled mostly shut. He stopped in front of it. "Jasper's in there," he said low. "How old? 6. Has he been like this since his mother passed?" He looked at the door instead of at her. "He talked before, plenty." A pause, he just stopped. Mara looked at the door too. "Has a doctor seen him?" "Doctor's 40 miles, and he's not sick. He eats, he sleeps, he just—" Wade stopped, started again. "He hasn't found his way back yet." Mara stood there a moment, thinking about what a 6-year-old boy decides when the thing he loved most in the world stops existing. The way silence becomes the only language that makes sense for a while. "Has anyone been patient about it?" she asked. Wade didn't answer right away. "We're all doing what we can," he said finally. She took that as a no. Not from cruelty, from exhaustion and grief, and 4 people trying to survive in the same house without enough of anything. She didn't sleep well that first night. The room they'd put her in, the storage room, cleared out and furnished with a cot and a washstand, was clean enough, and Cecily had put a folded quilt at the foot of the cot without being asked, which Mara noticed. But the wind moved through the walls in ways she wasn't used to, and sometime around 2 in the morning, she heard footsteps in the hall, small, careful footsteps that stopped outside her door and then went back the way they came. She lay in the dark and thought about what she was considering. She had come out here with the intention of seeing the situation honestly, before committing to anything. That was what she'd written in her letter, and she'd meant it. And the situation was honest. All right, honestly struggling, honestly broken in several places. Honestly's asking more of her than she had perhaps calculated when she was reading that letter at the kitchen table in Cincinnati. She thought about the 3 books in her trunk. She thought about Cecily's apron. She thought about Eli saying Papa tries with that matter-of-fact sorrow that children carry so much more lightly than adults. She thought about Jasper's door. She did not think about turning around. She wasn't sure when she'd decided not to. Maybe on the wagon ride out, watching the property appear over the rise. Maybe at dinner, watching Cecily serve her siblings before herself, with the automatic care of someone who'd long since stopped keeping track of what she was owed. Maybe it was Eli's handshake, serious and small and offered without reservation. She didn't know. But she knew she was staying. She told Wade the next morning. He was at the stove when she came down, attempting coffee in a pot that had seen better days. He looked like he hadn't slept either, which she filed away without comment. "I want to be direct with you," she said. He poured coffee into a cup and set it in front of her. "All right, this is harder than your letter made it sound. I know, the house needs work. The fence needs work. Your children need—" she chose the words carefully. "More than they're getting. More than one person can give them while also keeping this ranch running." He said nothing. He was looking at the cup in front of him. "I'm not saying that to judge you," she said. "I'm saying it because if I'm going to stay, I need us both to be honest about what this is and what it needs." He looked up then. "You're staying? If we agree on some things." He put the pot back on the stove, sat down across from her. "What things?" "Cecily goes back to being a 14-year-old girl," Mara said. "Not the household manager. Not the second parent. She does chores, yes. But she also goes to school and she has time that belongs to her and she stops serving herself last." Wade's jaw tightened. "She doesn't complain. I know she doesn't," Mara said. "That's not the same as it being fair." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. "What else?" "Eli needs to be in school. Not just doing ranch work. He wants to help. He wants you to not fall apart," she said, and regretted it slightly when she saw his face. But she didn't take it back. "He's 10 years old and he's trying to hold this together for you. That's too much weight." The silence that followed was long enough that she thought she might have miscalculated, pushed too hard too fast. But then Wade leaned back in his chair and pressed a hand over his face and exhaled in a way that sounded like something that had been held in for a long time, finally finding a small opening. "What about Jasper?" he asked from behind his hand. "Jasper, I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I'd like the chance to try." He lowered his hand. His eyes were red at the edges, which she pretended not to notice. "And what do you want in return," he said, "for all this?" Mara thought about it. "A fair chance," she said. "And no one lying to me about how bad things are." He almost laughed. "Not quite, but close. I can do that," he said. The first week was the hardest. Not because of the work Mara was used to work. It was the management of 4 separate human beings in various states of grief and need and guarded hope. Cecily watched her with the careful attention of someone waiting for the moment the act fell apart. Eli helped wherever Mara pointed him and seemed almost unnervingly eager to please, which worried her more than resistance would have. Pearl moved through the house like weather, sometimes present and visible, sometimes gone upstairs without explanation, always drawing in that composition book she carried. And Jasper stayed in his room. On the 3rd day, Mara made a second bowl of oatmeal in the morning and carried it upstairs herself. She knocked on the door 2 light knocks, then waited. Nothing. She set the bowl on the floor outside the door and went back downstairs. She did this every morning for 4 days. On the 5th day, when she came to collect the bowl, it was inside the room, pushed back out under the door empty. On the 6th day, she sat down in the hallway outside his door with her mending, and worked there for an hour before going back down. She didn't knock. She didn't call his name. She just sat close enough that he could hear the small domestic sounds of needle through cloth and thread being pulled taut. On the 7th day, the door opened 3 inches. A pair of brown eyes looked at her through the gap. She looked back. Then she went back to her mending. "I made biscuits this morning," she said conversationally to the gap in the door. "If you want some, they're on the stove." The door didn't open any further, but it didn't close either. She sat for a few minutes more, then gathered her mending and went downstairs. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard very faintly the sound of the door opening all the way, small feet on the floorboards, then the creak of the top step. She went to the stove and didn't turn around. By the end of the 2nd week, something was shifting in the house. Mara wasn't sure any of them could name it. It wasn't warmth exactly, not yet. More like the particular quality of air in a room where someone has opened a window after a long winter. The children were going to school again. Cecily had been relieved of breakfast duty and had spent the extra 30 minutes reading, which was clearly something she'd given up so long ago she'd almost forgotten she liked it. Eli had stopped checking the barn before school every morning because Mara had quietly made it clear that this was not his job and that the cattle would still be there when he came home. Pearl was still quiet, but she'd started leaving her drawings on the kitchen table instead of taking them upstairs, which Mara suspected was an invitation of some kind. She admired them carefully, and specifically not with the vague encouragement of adults who aren't really looking, but with actual attention. She asked questions about them. Pearl answered in short sentences that gradually got longer, and Jasper came to breakfast now. He sat at the end of the bench nearest the door, like he was keeping his options open, and he ate with the focused seriousness of a small animal that has decided to cautiously trust the hand that keeps leaving food. He still didn't talk, but he watched Mara with an intensity that she found both disconcerting and in some way she couldn't quite explain, fortifying. Wade was harder. He was not unkind, she'd give him that. He was not the kind of man who dismissed her opinions or made her feel her work was invisible. When she fixed the porch board herself on a Thursday afternoon while he was out checking fences, he came home and looked at it for a moment and said, "You did that yourself." It wasn't quite a question. "Wasn't difficult," she said. "Just needed someone with time to do it." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. That was how most of their conversations went, practical, respectful, careful on both sides. They were two people trying to coexist around a shared purpose without imposing on the other's grief. Mara's grief was smaller, an older 3 years spent rebuilding from the quiet disaster of Thomas Elias, and her parents' early deaths, and the boarding house, and the particular loneliness of being capable and completely alone. Wade's grief was a recent wound that hadn't closed and that he clearly did not want her near. She didn't push. She was patient in the way that she was always patient, not as a strategy, but because she understood that some things couldn't be hurried without breaking. But she watched. She watched him talk to the cattle in the same low voice that she suspected he'd once used with the children. She watched him stop in the kitchen doorway sometimes in the evenings and look at his family, at the table, really look at them, the way you look at something you are afraid of losing, and then come in and sit down without saying anything. She watched him help Pearl with her figure's homework without being asked. His big rough hand guiding the small pencil, something in his face going softer in a way he probably wasn't aware of. He was still in there, under all that grief and debt and the relentless physical labor of keeping a struggling ranch together. There was still a father in there, she thought. He just needed someone to cover some of the ground for him while he found his way back. The letter from the bank arrived on a Tuesday. Mara saw it on the table when she came in from the chicken house, and she knew what it was before she even read it. She'd handled enough correspondence in her life to recognize the particular quality of paper that official bad news came on. Wade came in an hour later and picked it up without speaking and read it standing at the table. She watched his face. He put it back down. "Crow's calling the mortgage," he said. His voice was flat in a way that scared her more than anger would have. 30 days. Can he do that? She asked. Says here he can. He pushed the letter across the table. She read it. It was written in the careful language of someone who had lawyers to thank for the phrasing, full of terms like "per the conditions of the original agreement" and "at the holder's discretion," and other phrases designed to sound inevitable. "Do you have a copy of the mortgage contract?" she asked. "Somewhere. Find it tonight." He looked at her. "Tonight," she repeated. He found it. They sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and read through it together by lamplight. And Mara read slowly. the way she read when she was looking for the specific thing that someone hoped you wouldn't notice. Her sewing work had taught her to look for where the seam was wrong, the place where the cloth didn't lie flat, the hidden tension pulling everything off. "Here," she said, and put her finger on a clause. Wade leaned in. "What am I looking at, this condition?" "At the holder's discretion clause. It's contingent on a prior written warning of no less than 60 days. She looked at him. "Has he sent you a warning letter?" Wade went still. "No," he said slowly. "No, he hasn't." Then calling it in 30 days is a breach of his own contract. She sat back. "Either knows that and is hoping you won't catch it, or his lawyer is sloppy. Either way, it means you have time." Wade stared at the document for a long moment. "You read legal documents," he said. "I read everything," she said, "and I pay attention." He looked at her then, not the quick sideways look she'd gotten used to, but a straight, full look, the kind that takes stock of a person. "We should see a lawyer," she said, "in town. Whoever Crow doesn't own." "That's a short list in Blackridge," he said. "Then we go to the county seat." She folded the contract carefully. "I'll come with you," he didn't argue. The next morning, Mara woke at 5 and lay in the dark for a moment before getting up, turning Crow's letter over in her mind. There was something about it that nagged at her beyond the legal irregularity. She'd found a quality to the timing that felt deliberate. Why now? The mortgage had been in place for years, presumably. Why press it this winter, this season? She thought about the fence line, the abandoned property they'd passed on the way in, the lean to pulling away from the house, a ranch in clear financial distress, 4 children, a widower, and now a new wife who'd been there 3 weeks. She got up and started the stove and stood in the kitchen thinking while the water heated, and by the time the coffee was done, she'd arrived at a conclusion that made her feel cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Crow didn't just want the mortgage paid. He wanted the land. The 30-day notice wasn't a mistake or a breach was a provocation. He was trying to see how Wade would respond, whether he'd fold quietly or fight. And he was doing it now because now, with a new wife and a household in transition and a wounded man at the center of it, was the moment a ranch looked most vulnerable. She poured her coffee, stood at the window and looked out at the gray pre-dawn light on the land that Crow intended to own. She thought about Eli saying Papa tries. She thought about Pearl's drawings on the kitchen table. She thought about Jasper's brown eyes looking at her through the 3-inch gap in his door. She set down her coffee cup. If Gideon Crow thought he was dealing with a struggling widower and 4 orphaned children, he hadn't looked closely enough. He was dealing with Mara Whitlock, and she was not done yet. The lawyer's name was Edmund Rask, and he worked out of a narrow office above a dry goods store in Callum Crossing, which was the county seat, and 41 miles from Blackridge Ranch by wagon road. He was a small man with a careful face, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent years listening to other people's disasters without letting it touch their own equilibrium. He read through the mortgage contract twice. He read Crow's letter once. Then he set both documents flat on his desk and looked at them for a moment, as if they were something he'd seen before in slightly different clothing. "The 60-day clause is clear," he said. "Crow's letter is in violation of his own terms." "That's what we thought," Mara said. Rask glanced at her, the kind of glance that men of his generation gave to women who spoke first in legal discussions, brief and recalibrating. "You read the original contract," he said. "I did." "Where did you study?" "I didn't," she said. "I read carefully." He almost smiled, then he turned to Wade. "Mr. Mercer, I can send a formal response to Crow's office within the week citing the breach. That buys you time, likely another 60 days at minimum, possibly more if he decides not to push it to court. But I want to be honest with you." He folded his hands on the desk. "Crow has 2 judges in this county that I'm aware of. If he decides to ignore the clause and pursue foreclosure anyway, the legal fight will be expensive, and it won't be fast." "How expensive?" Wade said. Rask named a figure. Wade said nothing, but his jaw tightened in the way Mara had learned to read as him doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. "There's also this," Rask said. He pulled a second document from a file drawer not theirs, something already in his possession. 2 weeks ago, I received a visit from a man representing the Blackridge County Land Office. He was asking questions about properties in your district, specifically about which ones might be available for acquisition in the coming season. He looked at Wade over the paper. Blackridge Ranch was on his list. The room went quiet. "That's before Crow sent his letter," Mara said. "By 9 days, yes." She looked at Wade. He was looking at the document in Rask's hands with the expression of a man who has suspected something and hoped to be wrong. "So the foreclosure notice was already planned," she said, "before he sent it." "That would be my reading," Rask said. Wade leaned forward in his chair. "What does he want with the land?" he said. "It's a cattle ranch. It's not even the biggest one in the district." "There's talk," Rask said carefully, "of a rail line. Northern extension. Nothing confirmed. Nothing public." But if the route runs where certain people believe it will, he left the sentence there. Wade sacked slowly. A rail line. Land that currently ran at a loss would be worth 3 or 4 times its value inside 2 years if a train depot went in nearby. Mara understood it immediately the way a piece of cloth looks worthless until you see what it becomes when it's part of the finished pattern. Crow wasn't interested in Blackridge Ranch as a cattle operation. He was interested in the land it sat on, and he needed Wade out before the route was announced. "All right," Mara said. She folded her hands in her lap. "Send the response letter. We'll deal with the rest as it comes." Rask looked at her again with somewhat more attention this time. "You have a plan," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I have a beginning of one," she said. The ride back to Blackridge took most of the afternoon, and they didn't talk much for the first hour. The road was empty in both directions, and the sky was doing something complicated in the west, building up in layers of gray and purple that promised weather by nightfall. The horse knew the road, and Wade let it set its own pace, and Mara sat beside him with the folded mortgage contract in her coat pocket and thought. "You're angry," she said eventually. "Not at you." "I know that, but you are." He was quiet for a moment. "I've known Crow was watching this place for 2 years," he said. "I just thought I don't know what I thought. That if I kept the payments current, he'd have no grounds." A beat. Clara died and everything slowed down. The payments got late twice. Not missed. Late. And he sent men out to look at the fence lines the following month. He shook his head. "I should have gone to Rask then." "You were managing your family," Mara said. "I was managing badly," he said. "Let's be accurate." She let that sit. It was true enough that arguing with it would have been condescending, and condescension was something she suspected Wade Mercer had very little patience for. "We have the 60-day clause," she said. "That's real. That gives us time to get the payments current and document the ranch properly." "The payments aren't the problem," he said. "I can get current by spring if the cattle sell at a fair price. The problem is Crow doesn't actually want the payments." He glanced at her sidelong. "He wants me gone, then we make it very difficult to get us gone," she said. He turned to look at her more directly. "Us," he said. It was the first time that word had been used between them referring to anything shared. She'd said it without thinking, and she was not going to unsay it now. "Us," she confirmed. He turned back to the road. His hands on the reins shifted slightly, not nervousness. Something more like a man adjusting to new weight. After a moment, he said quietly, "Clara would have liked you." Mara didn't know what to do with that, so she said nothing. But she felt it land somewhere and stay. The weather came in that night. Not the full force of it that would come later. In ways none of them were entirely prepared for, but the leading edge, cold and mean and determined. The wind hit the north side of the house hard enough to find every gap in the walls, and Mara lay awake listening to it and making a mental list of what needed to be done before the real winter set in. She'd been making lists since she arrived. It was how she thought, not in broad, vague intentions, but in specific sequences, one thing at a time, each thing leading to the next. The porch board had been a list. The kitchen curtains had been a list. Cecily going back to school had been a list, starting with who made breakfast now that Cecily didn't have to. The mortgage problem was a longer list, but it was still a list. And lists could be worked through. The children were her more immediate concern. Pearl was 7 days behind in her school reading, which Mara had discovered when she sat down with her one evening and asked to see her primer. Pearl hadn't gone red with embarrassment, the way some children would. She'd just looked at the book with a kind of resigned practicality, like a person who's been behind long enough that the gap has become normal. Mara didn't make a production of it. They just sat down together every evening after supper and read. Eli's numbers were worse than his reading, which surprised her, since he had the instincts of a boy who calculated things: how many miles of fence, how many bales of hay, how many days until the payment was due. But formal arithmetic on a page was something different, and he'd missed enough school that the foundation had holes in it. She started there. She sat with him at the table and didn't talk about the ranch. She just talked about the numbers. He was quick once he understood that she wasn't going to criticize him for not knowing something he'd never been taught properly. Cecily was the most complex situation. The girl was smart genuinely, specifically, deeply smart in the way that occasionally appeared in people regardless of circumstance, the kind of intelligence that would have gone to school for many years in a different life. But she'd spent the past 14 months running a household, and the muscles she'd built were the wrong ones for being 14. She was vigilant when she should have been able to relax. She anticipated problems before they existed. She apologized for things that weren't her fault with a speed that suggested she'd learned to do it preemptively. Mara didn't address it directly. She couldn't, not yet. What she could do was peel responsibilities off Cecily one at a time and make sure the girl noticed she'd been relieved of them, not just transferred to someone else. When Cecily reached for the breakfast pot in the mornings, Mara was already at the stove. When Cecily started for the younger children's coats before school, Mara was already handing them out. Small things, consistent things, the message being, "This is not your job anymore." It took Cecily about 10 days to believe it. And then one morning Mara came downstairs and found her sitting in the front room with her book, reading in the early light before breakfast was on. And she had a look on her face that Mara recognized as the specific fragile expression of someone discovering that something they thought was gone has been quietly restored. Mara went past her to the kitchen and didn't say anything. Some things you don't say, you just let them happen. Jasper started talking on a Wednesday. Not much. Not to everyone. But the morning he did it, Mara was in the kitchen, and he was on his customary seat at the end of the bench, watching her turn cornbread in the skillet, and without any preamble, he said, "Do the chickens have names?" She didn't startle. She had learned to be very still around Jasper, the way you're still around something that came to you on its own terms, and will leave the same way if you move wrong. "Not yet," she said. I wasn't sure whose job that was. He considered this with great seriousness. "I could do it," he said. "I was hoping you'd say that," she said. "I'm not very good at names." She put a piece of cornbread on a plate and set it at his spot, without looking at him directly, because looking at him directly still seemed to make him uncertain. She heard him pick it up. After a moment he said, "The brown one should be Hazel." "That's a good name," she said. "Put it on the list." "There's a list?" "There is now." He ate his cornbread. Then, just before the others came down, he said very quietly, "Mama used to name things." Mara kept her eyes on the skillet. "Tell me about her," she said. He did. Haltingly, in the staggered way of small children who are retrieving something from a deep place, a sentence, a pause, another sentence. He told her about his mother's red apron, about how she used to sing off-key and know she was off-key and not stop, about a horse named Dollar who threw a shoe once and his mother walked it all the way back from the south pasture, talking to it the whole way. By the time Cecily came downstairs, he'd stopped talking. But the door, Mara thought, was open now, just barely, just enough. The welfare complaint arrived on a Thursday, delivered by a county officer named Prentice, who had the apologetic manner of a man doing a job he didn't much care for. He was young, late 20s? Probably. And he stood on the newly repaired porch with his hat in his hands and explained that he'd received a complaint regarding the care of the children at Blackridge Ranch and was required to conduct a welfare check. Wade opened the door wider and looked at him for a moment. "Who filed it?" he said. "I'm not at liberty. Who filed it?" The officer shifted his weight. "The complaint came through the Blackridge County Welfare Office," he said carefully. "I can't tell you more than that." Wade looked at Mara. She was standing just behind him, and she had already done the arithmetic. "Come in," she said to the officer, stepping past Wade. "I'll show you the house." She showed him everything. The kitchen, which was clean, stocked, and had evidence of regular meals on the stove and in the cold cellar. The children's rooms, which were orderly and had adequate bedding. The school attendance records she'd started keeping, she'd begun writing them down her second week on the property, which in retrospect felt almost like she'd known something was coming, though she hadn't. She just kept records because records mattered. She called the children in one at a time. Eli, who was self-possessed enough to answer the officer's questions with the directness of a boy who understood he was being evaluated and wasn't afraid of it. Pearl, who was quieter, but showed him her drawings unprompted, which somehow communicated more than any formal answer could. Cecily, who was 17 years old in a 14-year-old's body when she sat down across from Prentice and folded her hands and answered his questions with the composed precision of someone who had absolutely nothing to hide. Jasper sat in the doorway of the front room and watched the officer with the same focused intensity he'd turned on Mara 2 months ago. When Prentice said gently, "And you're Jasper?" the boy nodded. When Prentice asked if he was doing all right, Jasper looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Hazel laid 2 eggs this morning." Prentice wrote something in his notebook. "Is Hazel your pet?" "Chicken," Jasper said. "She's good at it." He walked away after that, apparently satisfied that the interview was complete. Prentice stood in the kitchen with his notebook and his hat, and looked at Mara with the expression of a man who has come expecting one thing and found something else entirely. "The complaint alleged inadequate nutrition and unsupervised children," he said. "You've seen the kitchen," she said. "I have. And the children were supervised enough to speak to you themselves." She kept her voice even. "What else do you need?" He looked down at his notebook. "Mrs. Mercer." He stopped, looked up. "You were Mrs. Mercer?" "I am," she said. It was the first time she'd used the name. It felt less strange than she expected. "The complaint was very specific," he said. Specific in a way that well. It was specific about dates and details that suggested the person who filed it hadn't been here recently, or at all. He hesitated. "I'll be writing in my report that I found no basis for the complaint." She held his gaze. "Who told you to come here, Officer Prentice?" she said. Wasn't a question anymore. He put his hat back on. I received the complaint through the county office, he said quietly. That's all I can say. He looked at Wade, who had been standing in the doorway the whole time. Your family looks fine, Mr. Mercer. I'm sorry to have bothered you. He left. They listened to his horse on the road until the sound was gone. Then Wade turned and looked at Mara. Crow, he said. Yes, she said. He filed a welfare complaint on my children. His voice was flat again. That particular flatness she'd learned meant something was burning underneath that he was keeping extremely controlled. He wanted the children removed, she said. Without the children, you'd have no reason to hold the land. You'd sell and move somewhere smaller. She paused. He's trying to dismantle this family piece by piece. Wade looked at the door Prentice had just walked out of. He doesn't know who he's dealing with, Wade said. Mara thought, neither do you, actually. But she didn't say it. We need to document everything from this point forward, she said instead. Every meal, every school attendance, every repair, every payment, every single thing that happens on this ranch gets written down with a date. You've already been doing that, he said. He'd seen her ledger on the shelf. More thoroughly now, she said, because if Crow went to the welfare office, he'll try something else next. And when he does, I want a record that's airtight. She went to the shelf and took down the ledger and opened it to a fresh page. At the top of it, she wrote the date and welfare complaint unfounded. Officer Prentice, County Welfare, filed by unknown party through Blackridge County office. She wrote it in her clearest handwriting, because clarity mattered when something might be read by a judge. 3 days later, Holt Duggan came by in the early afternoon, the same neighbor who'd collected her from the station on her first day, the one who'd driven her out in near total silence. He came in, accepted coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the careful unhurry of a man who has something to say and is deciding how to say it. There's talk in town, he said finally. About the ranch, Wade said. About the welfare complaint. Duggan wrapped both hands around his cup. Prentice told his wife told the women at the general store. You know how that goes. He looked at Wade. People are angry. About who filed it. Do people know who filed it? Mara asked. Not for certain. But the land office connection's not a secret. Duggan looked at her directly. You've done a good job here, Mrs. Mercer. People can see it. The children are in school. The place looks better, folks notice. They didn't say anything before, Wade said. There was an edge to it, not accusation, just truth. No, Duggan admitted. They didn't. That's a fair point. He turned his cup in his hands. But they're saying something now. There are 4 families who've said they'll testify on your behalf if it comes to a legal proceeding. The school teacher, Miss Albright, has already written something. I don't know what exactly, but she's written it. Mara filed that away. Thank you, Holt, she said. He stood, put on his hat. That rail line rumor, he said, almost as an afterthought to Wade. It's not a rumor anymore. Someone from the territory office was in Callum Crossing last week, asking about land acquisition. Eastern route. He looked at Wade steadily. You're sitting right in the middle of where they'd want to put a depot. He left without saying anything more. Mara stood in the kitchen after the door closed and looked at the ledger on the shelf and thought about Gideon Crow sitting in his bank office with his land lists and his lawyers and his cultivated judges, moving pieces around a board he thought only he could see. She thought about Rask's letter going to Crow's office, citing the 60-day clause. She thought about Prentice's report sitting in a county file with no basis found written in official ink. She thought about 4 families willing to testify, and a school teacher who'd already put something in writing. She thought about Jasper naming his chickens and Cecily reading in the morning light and Eli doing his arithmetic without looking guilty about not being in the barn. Crow thought he was dismantling a family. He had no idea he was shoring one up. The formal wedding, such as it was, happened on a Saturday in late November, in the front room of the house, with Rask present as a witness and Duggan as the second. It was not a ceremony anyone would describe as romantic. It was a legal document being executed, and both Wade and Mara understood it as such, and the understanding between them about why they were doing it to strengthen her legal standing in any custody or property dispute that followed sat in the room alongside them without embarrassment. But something happened during it that Mara hadn't calculated. When Rask asked if either of them had anything they wished to say before signing, the room went quiet. Mara looked at Wade, expecting nothing they'd agreed. This was practical. They'd been clear with each other about that. But Wade looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was not practical at all, something that had been working its way up through the controlled surface of him for weeks, and he said, "Quiet, I know this isn't what either of us imagined, but I want you to know that I'm grateful, not just for the help." He stopped. Started again, "For what you've done for them." Mara looked at him. "They're easy to do things for," she said. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't everything. But it was true, and truth in that room felt like more than ceremony would have. The children were present. Cecily stood with her hands folded and her face carefully composed, in the way she had of looking older than she was. Eli stood beside her with his shirt tucked in, which he'd done himself. Pearl had brought her composition book, which nobody mentioned, and Jasper stood at the edge of the group with his hands in his pockets, watching with those serious brown eyes. After Rask finished the paperwork and Duggan shook Wade's hand and said something low and congratulatory, Jasper walked up to Mara and looked at her for a moment. Then he put his arms around her middle and pressed his face against her side. She put her hand on the back of his head. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that would have been better than that. December came in cold and deliberate, the way December did in the Northern Territories, not all at once, but with a persistence that made clear it intended to stay. The cattle needed more attention. The hay stores were adequate but not comfortable. Mara and Wade both started watching the sky with the practiced wariness of people who know what certain cloud formations mean. The letter from Crow's lawyer came the first week of December. It was different from the first letter, not a foreclosure threat this time, but something more surgical. It cited Wade's financial instability. It cited the recent marriage worded carefully as a hasty arrangement entered into, under financial duress, and it raised questions about the welfare of the children in a household under such circumstances. At the bottom it contained a name she didn't recognize, Harlan Voss, representing the interests of Mr. and Mrs. Cornelius Aldridge. She showed it to Wade that evening. "Who are the Aldridges?" she asked, even though something in his face when he read the name told her she wasn't going to like the answer. He set the letter on the table. "Clara's parents," he said. The room was very quiet. "They want the children," she said. "They always wanted the children," he said. "They never thought I was good enough for Clara. When she died," he stopped. "They sent a letter 6 months after the funeral. Said they could provide better. I told them no. And now Crow has found them," Mara said. "Or they found Crow." He looked at the letter. "They have money. They have a house in the city. They have lawyers." He looked up at her. A judge looking at this family on paper. A struggling rancher. A mail-order wife he's known for 10 weeks. 4 children. A mortgage in dispute, and then looking at Clara's parents' in the city. "Don't do that," she said. He stopped. "Don't decide what a judge would see before we've stood in front of one," she said. "We don't know that yet." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not afraid of this," he said. She was afraid of it. She was afraid of it in a deep, specific way that she was not going to show him, because one of them had to be the steady one tonight, and it was going to be her. "I'm going to write some letters," she said. "Tonight. Rask needs to know about the Aldridges. And I want to write to Prentice, not formally, just asking about the procedure for how a welfare complaint gets into the county record. Something about that complaint bothers me, and I want to know more." She pulled the ledger from the shelf and opened it. "And tomorrow," she said, "I'm going to ask Cecily, Pearl, Eli, and Jasper what they want. Not what we think is best, what they want." Wade watched her uncap the ink and pick up her pen. "Mara," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. Again, she looked back at the page. "Stop thanking me," she said. "Help me spell Cornelius." He almost laughed. "Not quite, but close enough." She wrote the letters. Outside, the wind was picking up, moving through the eaves of the house with a sound like something preparing. The lamp burned steady on the table. In the rooms above them, 4 children slept. The storm was still coming, but inside Blackridge Ranch, for the first time since Mara had arrived in the November rain, the house felt like something that intended to stand. The letters went out the following morning, 3 of them, in Mara's careful handwriting, sealed and given to Duggan when he passed on his way to town. 1 to Rask. 1 to Prentice, worded precisely, asking only procedural questions about how welfare complaints were logged and cross-referenced in the county system. The 3rd to a woman named Dorothea Crane, who ran the boarding house in Callum Crossing, where Mara had spent one night during the trip to see Rask, and who had mentioned, during a 15-minute conversation over cold coffee, that she'd been keeping records of land acquisition inquiries in the county for the past 2 years, because, as she put it, something smelled wrong, and she intended to know what it was when it finally surfaced. Mara had liked Dorothea Crane immediately. She didn't tell Wade about the 3rd letter, not because she was keeping secrets from him, but because she wasn't sure yet what Dorothea had, or whether it would amount to anything, and she'd learned early in her life that telling people about unformed plans only made them anxious about outcomes that hadn't arrived yet. She would tell him when there was something to tell. In the meantime, there was the ranch. The cold had settled in seriously now, the kind that came down from the Northern Territories with the particular commitment of something that had been saving itself all autumn. The cattle needed checking twice a day. The water troughs were icing over by morning and had to be broken and cleared before the animals could drink. The woodpile, which had looked adequate in November, was looking less so by mid-December, and Mara spent 2 hours one afternoon reorganizing it against the east wall of the barn in a configuration that sheltered it better from the wind, a small thing, but the kind of small thing that prevented a large problem. Wade noticed. He always noticed the physical things she did to the property, and he acknowledged them with the same spare directness he'd shown since the beginning, not effusive, not performative, just a nod or a word or occasionally the look of a man recalculating something. "You know about wood stacking," he said when he saw what she'd done. "My father cut wood for a living until his back gave out," she said. "I stacked it from the time I was 8. He looked at the new arrangement. "That'll keep it drier," he said. "That's the idea." They stood in the cold for a moment, both looking at the stack. It was the kind of domestic moment that accumulates over time into something that resembles a life, the unremarkable shared noticing of a thing done right. Mara didn't examine it too closely. She just let it be what it was. The conversation with the children happened on a Sunday afternoon, in the front room, without ceremony. Mara had simply asked them after midday dinner if they'd sit with her a while, and they had Cecily on the chair nearest the window, with her book in her lap in case she needed something to look at, Eli on the floor with his back against the settee in the posture of a boy pretending to be more relaxed than he was, Pearl on the settee itself with her composition book, and Jasper on the rug near the hearth, not because he was cold but because he'd decided the rug was a good place to be. Wade was in the barn. Mara had waited for a time when he wasn't in the house. Not because this conversation excluded him, but because it needed to happen without the children watching their father's face for cues about how to answer. She sat in the straight-back chair across from them and looked at them for a moment. "You know about the letter," she said. It wasn't a question. Cecily's face confirmed it. The girl heard everything, had always heard everything. It was one of the occupational hazards of being the oldest in a house where adults were too tired to be careful. "The one from the lawyers," Cecily said. "Yes." "Do you understand what it means?" A pause. Eli picked at a thread on his boot. Pearl's pencil went still. "Grandma and Grandpa Aldridge want us to live with them," Cecily said. Her voice was neutral in a way that took effort. "They're petitioning the court for custody." "Yes," Mara said. "A judge will hear the case and make a decision." She kept her tone even not falsely calm, not alarming. "Just true. I need to know what you want, not what you think you're supposed to say. What you actually want." Silence. Eli looked at the floor. Pearl looked at her composition book. Jasper was watching the fire. Cecily spoke first. "We don't want to go," she said. Then, as if she'd heard how simple that sounded for something so complicated, she added, "They have a nice house. In the city, Grandma Aldridge sends good Christmas boxes." She paused. "But they called Papa a failure in their letter. We're not supposed to have read it, but I did." She looked at Mara steadily. "We don't want to go." Eli looked up. "I want to stay," he said. No hesitation, no qualifications. Just the flat statement of a 10-year-old who had made up his mind. Pearl said very quietly, "Mama's buried here." The room was quiet for a moment. "I know," Mara said. Jasper turned from the fire. "If we go," he said with the precision of a 6-year-old working through a problem, "can Hazel come?" Something in Mara's chest did something complicated. "Chickens are hard to travel with," she said carefully. He looked at her. "Then I don't want to go," he said, and turned back to the fire. Fra sat with what they'd told her. It was not surprising she'd understood for weeks where these children's hearts were, but hearing it said plainly, by each of them in their own way, made it real in a different register. "All right," she said. "Then here's what we're going to do." What they were going to do, it turned out, was build a case. Mara started that same Sunday. She pulled the ledger from the shelf and began a second section, not daily records this time, but a systematic document. Every school attendance entry, with dates. Every note from Miss Albright about the children's progress, which she'd been collecting without fully knowing why. The receipt for the medical supplies she'd purchased when Eli got a nail through his boot in October. She'd cleaned and bandaged the wound herself. The receipt proved it had been treated properly and promptly. The record of Pearl's reading improvement week by week. The dates Jasper had begun coming downstairs, beginning to speak, naming his chickens. Cecily watched her work one evening from across the table. "What is all that?" she asked. "Evidence," Mara said. "That this family is healthy and cared for, and that this is where you belong." Cecily was quiet for a moment. "Will it work?" Mara looked up. "I don't know," she said, "but it's real. Everything in here is real. And real things are harder to argue with than stories." Cecily looked at the ledger. Then she went upstairs and came back down with a small notebook. Mara hadn't seen before a personal diary, by the look of it slim and worn at the corners. She set it on the table. "I've been keeping this since last winter," she said, writing down what happened each day. When things were bad, when they were better. She stopped. "When things changed after you came." She looked at Mara with the careful eyes of someone offering something they can't take back. "Would that help?" Mara looked at the notebook. "Yes," she said, "it would." The storm that Mara had been watching build for 2 weeks arrived on a Thursday night in the 3rd week of December, and it arrived without any of the hesitation of the weather that had preceded it. She woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of wind that was no longer finding gaps in the walls, but apparently attempting to make new ones, and snow that was hitting the north-facing windows with a sound like thrown sand. She lay still for a moment, listening to the house. The house was holding. The wood was in. The children were upstairs. She got up. By the time she was dressed and downstairs, Wade was already at the kitchen window. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad," he said. He didn't look away from the window. "The cattle are in the lower pasture. I need to get them moved to the shelter before the temperature drops further. I'll come with you." He turned from the window. "No," he said. "I need someone in the house with the children." She looked at him. He was right, there needed to be someone inside, but she didn't like the calculation that left him going out alone into whatever was happening on the other side of that door. "Take the rope," she said. "Tie it from the house to the barn before you go further." I know you know," she said. "Take the rope anyway." He took the rope. She watched him go out the door and disappear into a wall of white within 4 steps. She stood at the window and watched the rope he'd tied to the porch post go taut as he moved away from the house, and she kept watching it, the only evidence that he was still out there and still moving. The children came downstairs within the hour, drawn by the noise. Cecily came first, practical as always, and assessed the situation with a quick look at the window and a quicker look at Mara. "Papa's out there," she said. "Not a question, yes." "Is the rope up?" "Yes." Cecily nodded and went to put water on the stove. Eli came down behind her, then Pearl with her composition book tucked under her arm as if she might need it. Jasper came last, moving down the stairs with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided to be brave even though the sound of the wind scared him. He sat on the bench by the kitchen table and didn't say anything, and Mara sat beside him without saying anything either, and they both watched the window. An hour passed, too. The rope was still taut. Then, just before 5 in the morning, it went slack. Mara was at the door before she'd consciously decided to move. She found him at the barn door, which he'd managed to latch behind the last of the cattle. He was on one knee in the snow, his left arm pressed against his body at an angle that was immediately and specifically wrong, not broken. She didn't think, but the shoulder was out. She'd seen a dislocated shoulder once, on a man who'd fallen from a grain loft, and the shape of it was unmistakable. "Wade," she said. He looked up. His face was white from cold and tight with pain that he was managing through the clenched jaw method, which worked up to a point. "Get up," she said. "Don't use the left arm, I know," he said. She got him to his feet, and they got back to the house, the way they'd gotten to the barn, the rope, hand over hand, with the wind hitting them from the side, and the snow making the ground into something unreliable. When they got inside and the door was shut behind them, the sudden stillness of the kitchen felt like something dropped. Cecily had the stove going high. She took one look at her father's arm and said, "What do we do?" Mara was already thinking. The doctor was 40 miles away. In this weather, that might as well be 400. She had a medicine chest. She'd built one in her first week. Basic things, the kind of supplies you kept if you were sensible, but a dislocated shoulder was not something in a medicine chest. It was something you either knew how to handle, or you waited and hoped. And waiting in this case meant Wade's muscles would continue seizing around the joint until the damage from the dislocation was compounded by the damage from the prolonged displacement. She had seen it done once. She had not done it herself. She looked at Wade, who was sitting in the chair by the table, with his jaw still clenched and his eyes on her face. "I think I can put it back," she said. "I've seen it done. I know the principle of it." He held her gaze. "You think," he said. "I'm not going to lie to you about my certainty level." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm was still making its case for being the worst in recent memory. "All right," he said. "I need you to tell me if I'm doing it wrong," she said. "Don't go quiet on me." "I won't." She looked at Cecily. "Take the younger ones to the front room," she said. "Eli, I need you to stay." Eli straightened slightly. "I need someone to keep pressure here." She showed him where, while I work. Eli nodded with the expression of a boy who would rather be anywhere else and intends to stay. What followed was not clean or painless or anything that Mara would choose to revisit in her memory if she had options. She worked from what she remembered: the angle of the arm, the direction of pressure, slow and controlled movement rather than force, talking to Wade the entire time because she needed him conscious and because silence would have been worse for both of them. He made sounds that he was clearly trying not to make, and she didn't comment on them. Eli kept his hands exactly where she'd placed them and didn't look away even when she thought he might. When the joint went back, the sound was something that made Cecily come to the kitchen doorway, despite herself. Wade's exhale was long and ragged, and his head dropped forward, and for a moment nobody in the room moved. Then Eli, in a voice that was working very hard to be steady, said, "Did that work?" Wade lifted his head. "Yeah," he said. His voice was rough. "Yeah, that worked." Mara sat back on her heels. Her hands were not entirely steady, which she noted and chose not to show. "You need to keep it still for at least a week," she said. "No lifting, no fence work. Nothing with that arm." He looked at her. "The cattle need..." I'll handle the cattle, she said. He opened his mouth. Wade, she said, I'll handle the cattle. He closed his mouth. Then he looked at Eli. Your stepmother's bossy, he said. Eli, with the relieved humor of a child who has just survived something frightening, said, I noticed. The storm lasted 3 days. They were 3 days that Mara would later think of as the period when the family became something more specific than a collection of people living in the same house under shared circumstances. There was something about being confined together by weather of that scale, the wind that didn't stop, the snow that stacked against the windows until the lower panes were blocked, the darkness that came earlier than usual and stayed later, that stripped away the careful distances people maintain when they still have the option of going somewhere else. Wade couldn't use his left arm and was terrible at accepting help, which Mara had predicted and was patient about in the way she was patient about. Most things not with warmth, but with the steady persistence of someone who intends to outlast the resistance. She put his food in front of him without comment. She made sure the sling stayed on. When he tried to get up at 3 a.m. to check the cattle, she was awake before he reached the door. Sit down, she said, from the kitchen doorway. He stood in the dark in his socks. I just want to check. Eli checked them at 9. I checked them at midnight. They're in the shelter and they're fine. She moved past him to the stove and put on water. Sit down before you do something else to that arm. He sat. She made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table in the dark before dawn and didn't talk for a while, which was beginning to be a thing they could do, the comfortable kind of silence, the kind that doesn't require filling. I haven't been easy, he said eventually. She looked at him across the table. You've been in grief, she said, and under pressure. And managing 4 children and a ranch and a mortgage and a man who wants your land. She picked up her cup. Nobody would be easy under that. You have been, he said. I'm not in grief, she said, or I wasn't, not the same kind. She paused. And I'm stubborn. Stubbornness looks like steadiness from the outside. He looked at her with the full attention he didn't always give things. What were you in, he said, before you came here? She thought about the boarding house, about Thomas Elias and his family's quiet verdict, about the 3 years of mending other women's dresses and the $12.40 and the letter she'd read 3 times at the kitchen table. Stalled, she said. I was installed. He nodded slowly like he understood that specifically. Clara was sick for almost a year before she died, he said. It was the first time he'd offered this directly, without being asked. I kept thinking if I just kept the ranch together, kept everything running, that would I don't know, like the normal things continuing would hold it off. He looked at his cup. Didn't. No, she said. It doesn't work that way. When she went, he stopped. Started again. The children were so quiet. For weeks. Even Eli, who never stops talking, he shook his head. I didn't know how to reach them. I kept trying to fix physical things. The fence, the cattle, the roof. He looked up, because I couldn't fix the thing that was actually wrong. Mara sat with that. You kept them fed, she said, and housed, and together, barely. Barely counts, she said. Barely is still yes. He looked at her for a moment. Why didn't you turn around, he said. When you first arrived, when you saw what you were walking into. She thought about the answer. Cecily's apron, she said. He blinked. That apron had been washed so many times the color was gone, she said. She was wearing it when she opened the door. 14 years old with an apron that old and that worn, and she'd washed it. She hadn't just put on the dirty one. She'd taken the time to wash it and put it back on. Mara looked at the table. She was trying so hard. All of them were trying so hard. I couldn't walk away from that. Wade didn't say anything for a long time. I didn't notice the apron, he said finally. You were managing other things, she said. That's what I was for. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day, leaving behind it a landscape so altered by snow that the familiar landmarks of the ranch looked like they'd been replaced overnight. The fence lines were buried. The path to the barn was shoulder-high in drifts on one side. The shed where they kept the tools had a drift against its door that Eli spent the better part of a morning working through with a shovel, and he did it without being asked, which told Mara that something in the boy had shifted during the 3 days inside. Some weight had redistributed itself. Some understanding had settled in. Pearl had spent much of the storm drawing. She'd filled 6 pages of her composition book with images that Mara caught glimpses of, but didn't ask to see a child's privacy was worth something, she believed. And Pearl shared what she wanted to share when she was ready. But on the 2nd day of the storm, she'd come to where Mara was sitting by the lamp and set one drawing on the table beside her, and then gone back to the settee without explaining it. It was a drawing of the ranch, the house, the barn, the fence line, the lean-to that still angled away from structure done from above somehow, as if the girl had imagined herself looking down at it from a great height. And inside each building she'd drawn tiny figures. 5 of them in the house, the cattle in the barn, the chickens in the lean-to, every figure present, everyone accounted for. Mara looked at it for a long time. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the ledger, between 2 pages, where it wouldn't be damaged. The letter from Rask arrived the day after the storm, brought out by Duggan, who'd come to check on them, and who handed it over with the expression of a man who suspects the news inside is not good. It wasn't. The Aldridges had engaged a lawyer from the capital, a man named Whitmore, according to Rask, who was known in the territory courts and not favorably known by anyone who'd been on the opposing side. The custody petition had been formally filed, and a hearing date set, the 15th of February, which was 8 weeks away. Whitmore had already submitted a preliminary brief arguing that Wade's financial instability, combined with the recent and expedient marriage to a woman of no established local standing, created an environment of uncertainty unsuitable for 4 children who had experienced significant trauma. Rask wrote that he would be present and would argue for the family. He also wrote, in the careful language of a lawyer who told people the truth even when it complicated things, "I want you to be prepared for the argument they will make about Mrs. Mercer's background and the circumstances of the marriage. Whitmore will present it as opportunistic. We must be ready to demonstrate otherwise." Mara read the letter twice. Wade read it once. "They're going to make you the problem," he said. "They're going to try," she said. Wade. She set the letter on the table. "I knew this was coming. I've been preparing for this since the welfare officer left our porch." She met his eyes. "This is a fight about evidence, about what's real and what can be proved. I have records going back to my 2nd week on this property. Cecily has a diary. Miss Albright has a written statement. Prentice's report exists in the county file." She looked at him steadily. "What Whitmore has is money and a story. We have the truth." He held her gaze. "That's not always enough," he said. "I know," she said, "but it's what we have, and I intend to make it count." She wasn't frightened, or rather, she was frightened in the specific contained way she'd always been frightened of things that mattered, which looked from the outside like steadiness, and felt from the inside like a decision you made every hour. She had made it. She would keep making it. That evening, after the children were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and Cecily's diary and the growing stack of documents she'd been accumulating, and began to organize them into something that Rask could use. She numbered the pages. She cross-referenced the dates. She wrote a summary at the front 2 pages, clear and factual, beginning with the day she arrived and ending with the day of the storm, laying out every demonstrable thing that had happened to this family in the past 10 weeks, and what it proved about who they were and what they were building. It was past midnight when she finished. She closed the ledger and sat in the quiet kitchen and looked at the lamp. 8 weeks. It was not much time. But she thought about the girl who'd arrived here with $12.40 in a battered trunk, expecting something simple and finding something that required everything she had. She thought about how she'd stood at the window on the 3rd day of the storm watching Wade's rope go slack and moved to the door before she'd thought about it. Pure reflex, pure certainty, no calculation involved. She thought about what Jasper had said that first time he'd spoken to her. "Do the chickens have names?" She blew out the lamp. 8 weeks was enough, she decided. It had to be. And if Gideon Crow and Cornelius Aldridge and a lawyer named Whitmore from the capital thought they were walking into that courtroom against a mail-order bride with nothing to her name, they had fundamentally miscalculated what kind of woman had gotten off that train in November. She was not nothing. She had never been nothing. She went to bed. Outside, the snow on the ground reflected back the dark winter sky, and Blackridge Ranch stood exactly where it had always stood, battered, imperfect, stubbornly present. The cattle were in the shelter. The wood was stacked against the east wall. The rope from the house to the barn was still tied to the porch post. And inside, in 4 rooms above the kitchen, 4 children slept in their own beds, in their own home, on the land where their mother was buried. Mara intended to keep it that way. 8 weeks felt like nothing and everything at the same time. Mara had organized the documents into a leather satchel that Rask had sent out with Duggan, and she added to it almost every day, not obsessively, not in the manner of someone who has lost perspective on what they're doing, but with the focused regularity of a person who understands that a case is built the way a house is built, one thing at a time, each thing resting on the thing below it, and the whole structure only as sound as the least secure joint. She was looking for the weak joints. She was looking for them in her own evidence before Whitmore could find them first. January moved the way January does in the Northern Territories, slowly, with great conviction. The shoulder healed. Wade was back to full use of the arm by the 3rd week, which was faster than she'd expected and slightly faster than was wise. But she'd said her piece about it twice and didn't intend to say it a 3rd time. He was not a man who needed to be managed. He needed to be told a true thing once, clearly, and then trusted to make his own calculation. She respected that, even when his calculation and hers didn't align. The cattle came through the storm, without major loss, 2 animals with cold injury to their feet, one that had to be put down, which Wade did quietly on a Tuesday morning before the children were up. Eli knew. He didn't say anything about it, but he went out to the barn after school and stayed there for half an hour, and when he came back and his eyes were red at the edges in the way of a boy who had cried and wasn't going to mention it, Mara put a piece of pie in front of him without comment and let him eat in peace. The school report from Miss Albright arrived the second week of January, and it was better than anything Mara had dared to specifically hope for. All 4 children had improved across every subject since September. Cecily, who had apparently been years ahead in her reading even while managing the household, was now working from materials intended for older students at Miss Albright's suggestion. Eli's arithmetic had come up dramatically. Pearl had written an essay about a horse that Miss Albright had described in her cover note as possessing, and these were the teacher's exact words, which Mara read 3 times an emotional maturity unusual in a child her age, and a command of image that I have not seen in 10 years of classroom work. Jasper, who had missed considerable school the prior year, was now attending without exception, and had, according to Miss Albright, recently made his first friend, a boy named Thomas, who sat beside him and shared an interest in animals. Mara put the report in the satchel. Then she sat at the table and allowed herself, for approximately 3 minutes, to feel something that was not strategy or preparation, or controlled forward momentum. Something quieter. Something that had weight. Then she got up and started dinner. The reply from Dorothea Crane came the 3rd week of January, and it was worth the wait. Dorothea had been, in the months since Mara's brief visit, doing what she'd described keeping records. She was a methodical woman with an accountant's mind, and the particular tenacity of someone who had watched a pattern developing in her county, and had decided, with no legal authority and no official standing, to document it anyway. What she sent Mara was not evidence in the legal sense. It couldn't be entered directly as such, but it was a map. A timeline of land acquisition inquiries through the Blackridge County Land Office going back 18 months, cross-referenced against mortgage foreclosure notices filed during the same period, with names and dates and dollar amounts written in Dorothea's precise hand. The pattern was clear. 6 properties in the county had received foreclosure pressure in the 18 months preceding the anticipated rail route announcement. 3 had sold. 2 had fought and settled on terms that strongly favored the buyer. 1 Blackridge Ranch had not yet been resolved. Every property that had sold or settled had been purchased through intermediaries who traced, with varying degrees of indirection, back to a land holding company registered in the capital. A company whose primary investor, according to public incorporation records that Dorothea had taken the trouble to obtain, was Gideon Crow. Mara read the document twice, then she wrote to Rask. His response came back fast, for Rask 4 days, not 7. "This is significant," he wrote. "The direct connection between Crow and the land company is a matter of public record. What we have, combined with Mrs. Crane's timeline, is a demonstrable pattern of coordinated acquisition through induced financial distress. This is not merely aggressive banking. This is something a territorial court would take seriously if presented correctly. I will need Mrs. Crane to appear or provide a sworn affidavit. I will also need time to subpoena the land office records, which I believe will corroborate everything she has documented. The welfare complaint becomes significantly more consequential. In this context, it was not merely harassment. It was part of a coordinated effort to destabilize your family and your claim to the property," he added. "At the bottom, I also want to inform you that I have filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff regarding the welfare complaint. I believe there is enough to compel an investigation into how it was filed and who authorized it through official channels." Mara read the letter at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. Then she wrote back to Dorothea Crane and asked if she would be willing to provide a sworn affidavit. Dorothea's reply arrived in 3 days. "I've been waiting for someone to ask," she wrote. "Yes." She told Wade that evening after dinner, when the children were upstairs. She laid it out the way she always laid things out, clearly, without embellishment, in order. The Crow Land Company, the 6 properties, Dorothea's timeline, what Rask intended to do with it. Wade listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to rely on about him. He let you finish before he responded, and his responses were always about the actual thing you'd said, rather than the thing he'd already been thinking while you were talking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's been doing this to other families," he said. "Yes." And he stopped. Nobody connected it. Nobody was looking at the whole picture, she said. Each family was dealing with their own situation. They didn't have a reason to compare notes. She paused. Dorothea had a reason. She runs a boarding house. She talks to everyone who passes through, and she listens, and she writes things down. Wade shook his head slowly, not in defeat, in something harder to name. The particular feeling of discovering that the thing you've been fighting is larger and older than you knew. Does this help with the custody hearing? He said. Rask thinks it helps the context, she said. It shows that the welfare complaint was part of a coordinated attack on this family, not an independent concern for the children's welfare. It undermines the Aldridges' claim that the children need to be removed for their own protection, because if the disruption to this family was manufactured, then the instability Whitmore will argue about is manufactured too. He looked at her. You've thought this all the way through, he said. I've had 8 weeks, she said, and I don't sleep as much as I should. He almost said something then. She could see it cross his face. Something personal, something that was working its way up from whatever depth he kept those things at. But then Jasper called from upstairs about something to do with Hazel, and the moment passed, and Wade stood and went to the stairs, and Mara closed the satchel and put it back on the shelf. 10 days before the hearing, the Aldridges arrived in Blackridge. They came in a hired carriage from the county seat, a large carriage, well appointed, which made an impression on the main road through town, that Mara heard about from 3 different people before the day was out. Cornelius Aldridge was a heavy man in his 60s with the ruddy face of someone who ate and drank well, and had always had the means to do so. His wife, Harriet, was trim and pale and dressed in the manner of a city woman who wanted it known she was a city woman. They were staying at the only decent boarding house in Blackridge town, which was considerably less comfortable than they were accustomed to, and this circumstance was apparently making itself felt in how they spoke to the proprietor. They did not come to the ranch. What they did instead was send Whitmore. He arrived on a Wednesday morning, unannounced, in a dark coat with good buttons, and he knocked on the door with the particular knock of a man who expects it to be answered promptly. Mara answered it herself. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-40s maybe, with sharp eyes and the practiced pleasantness of someone who has learned that people are easier to underestimate when they feel comfortable. Mrs. Mercer, he said, I'm Franklin Whitmore. I represent Mr. and Mrs. Aldridge. I know who you are, she said. May I come in? She looked at him for a moment. She had thought about this possibility, the pre-hearing visit, the attempt to take stock of the situation before the formal proceeding, and she had decided how she would handle it. Not with hostility, not with warmth, with the precise cordiality of someone who has nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and is therefore not interested in a performance. You can come in, she said. My husband isn't here. He's working the cattle. That's fine, Whitmore said pleasantly. It's you I was hoping to speak with. She brought him to the kitchen. She poured coffee because that was what you did when someone came to your house and sat at your table, regardless of who they were or why they'd come. He accepted it and looked around the kitchen in the careful way of a man cataloging everything he saw. The kitchen was clean, the stove was going. On the shelf, clearly visible, were the ledger and the satchel. She had not hidden them. She had no reason to. I want to be direct with you, Whitmore said. I'd appreciate that, she said. My clients are not unreasonable people, he said. They lost their daughter 14 months ago. Their grandchildren are their connection to her. They have the means to provide these children with advantages that through no fault of their own, this household cannot currently offer. Good schools, medical care, financial security. Mara looked at him. Their grandchildren are currently in good schools, she said. I have attendance records and a letter from their teacher if you'd like to see them. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Of course, he said. I don't doubt that you've made efforts. They have medical care, she said. I have receipts for supplies and a treatment record from every health matter since my arrival. She kept her voice even. And the mortgage payments are current. I have receipts for those as well. He recalibrated. She could see him doing it, adjusting his approach the way a man adjusts his grip when he finds the thing he's holding is shaped differently than he expected. Mrs. Mercer, he said, the concern isn't only practical. It's about stability, continuity. These children have experienced significant loss. Being suddenly introduced to a new arrangement in the middle of that grief raises legitimate questions about what is best for them long term. You mean me, she said. The nature of the marriage arrangement, yes, he said carefully. I came here through an agency, she said. That is accurate. People have done that for generations. The arrangement is legal, the marriage is legal, and the family is functioning. She set down her cup. What specifically is your concern? He looked at her steadily. My concern, he said, is that a woman who arrived 11 weeks before the filing of a custody petition in a marriage of convenience, to a man under significant financial pressure, may not represent the stable long-term environment that 4 grieving children require. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. I understand that argument, she said. I expect to hear it again in court. I'm not going to debate it with you here. She stood. But I want to say one thing clearly, Mr. Whitmore, so that we understand each other. He looked up at her. I did not come to this family because of a letter, she said. I came because of a letter. There's a difference. I stayed because of these children specifically, not generally. And everything I've done since I walked through that door has been for them. Documented, verifiable, and real. She looked at him without blinking. If your clients want to argue that love shown through daily action counts for less than a bank account and a city address, I'm prepared to let a judge decide. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and picked up his hat. Thank you for the coffee, he said. You're welcome, she said. I'll see you in court. She showed him out and closed the door and stood in the front hallway for a moment, with her hand flat on the wood. Then she went back to the kitchen, sat down, and picked up her cup. Her hand was steady. She was grateful for that. 2 days before the hearing, Rask came out to the ranch in person. He sat at the kitchen table, with the satchel's contents spread before him, and went through everything with the systematic attention of a man who has tried enough cases to know which piece of paper matters and which is filler. He read Cecily's diary with a care that Mara noticed and appreciated, not skimming, really reading, turning each page with the attention it deserved. He looked at Pearl's school reports. He read Miss Albright's letter twice. He reviewed the welfare complaint record and the notation Prentice had made. No basis found. Then he looked up. Dorothea Crane will be there, he said. She's driving in tomorrow. I know, Mara said. I've arranged for her to stay at the Haverford place. He looked mildly surprised. You arranged her lodging. She's coming a long way to do us a favor, Mara said. The least we can do is make sure she doesn't have to sleep on a stranger's floor. He almost smiled. The land office subpoenas, he said, returning to the papers. I received the documents yesterday. They confirmed Dorothea's timeline completely. 6 properties in 18 months. Crow's company is on record as the ultimate buyer in 4 of them. He set the papers down. The sheriff's investigation into the welfare complaint has also produced something. The complaint was filed through the county office, but the original written report, the physical document that initiated it, was drafted on stationery from the Blackridge County Land Office. The room was very quiet. The same land office, Wade said. The same land office, Rask confirmed. The same office that had Blackridge Ranch on its acquisition list 9 days before Crow sent the foreclosure letter. Mara thought about Prentice, the young officer standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, with the apologetic manner of someone doing a job he didn't care for. She thought about how he'd noticed the complaint was too specific for someone who hadn't been to the property. She thought about the sentence he'd chosen when he left. Your family looks fine, Mr. Mercer. She thought he had known something was wrong with that complaint from the moment he received it. Is Prentice willing to speak to that? She asked. He has provided a statement, Rask said. He noted in it that the complaint contained details about the property and the family that were inconsistent with a genuine welfare concern. They were focused on financial matters, specifically the mortgage status, rather than on the children's actual physical or emotional condition. He paused. He also noted that when he arrived at the ranch, he found a household that was clearly functioning specifically, and I'm quoting his statement, better than most of the households I am asked to visit. Mara looked at the table. She thought about Jasper telling the welfare officer that Hazel laid 2 eggs that morning, with the complete seriousness of a 6-year-old reporting important news. All right, she said. What do we need to do tomorrow? The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. This was not unusual for her. She hadn't slept well the night before any situation that mattered since she was old enough to understand that some things had outcomes you couldn't control. She lay in the dark and went through the evidence in her head the way she'd gone through it 100 times on paper. The ledger, the school reports, Miss Albright's letter, Cecily's diary, Prentice's statement, Dorothea's affidavit, the land office documents, the chain of it, the way each piece supported the next. She heard Wade's door open sometime after 2. Footsteps in the hall, quiet and familiar by now. Then, instead of going downstairs, they stopped outside her door. She waited. Mara, he said, low enough not to wake the children. I'm awake, she said, a pause. He stopped. Started again. Can I come in for a minute? She sat up. Yes, she said. He came in and sat in the chair by the window, the straight-back chair she used for mending, and in the dark she could see the shape of him, the way he held himself, which was different from his daylight posture. Less managed, more tired. I keep thinking about what happens if it goes wrong, he said. I know, she said. He pressed his hand over his face. I keep thinking about how they looked this morning at breakfast. Normal. Arguing about something. Eli was trying to take Jasper's biscuit, and Jasper was telling him the exact reasons he couldn't have it. He laughed very quietly at whatever he was seeing in his memory. 6 years old, listing reasons. He's a thorough person, she said. Clara was like that, he said. Then, as if he'd surprised himself, he's like her. She sat with that. They all are, she said in different ways. He lowered his hand. I don't know how to thank you, he said, for all of this. He gestured vaguely, which she understood to mean everything: the documents, the satchel, Dorothea Crane's lodging arrangements. The 10 weeks of meals and school attendance records and mending done by lamplight and a dislocated shoulder put back in the dark during a storm. I don't have words for it. You don't need words for it, she said. That's not why I did it. Why did you do it, he said. Not challenging, genuinely asking, the way he asked things when he actually wanted to know. She thought about it. Because it needed doing, she said. And because I was here. And she paused. Because somewhere between Jasper's door and the chicken names, and Cecily reading in the morning light, this stopped being an arrangement I was honoring and became a thing I was choosing. She looked at him in the dark. I'm here because I choose to be here every day. That's the only answer I have. He was quiet for a long time. It's a good answer, he said. He sat there a while longer, not saying anything, and she didn't feel the need to fill it. At some point he stood and said goodnight and went back to his room, and she lay back in the dark and found, somewhat to her surprise, that the tight feeling in her chest had loosened enough that sleep was possible. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow was tomorrow. The courthouse in Callum Crossing was a 2-story brick building that smelled of old paper and damp wool and the particular institutional gravity of a place where things were decided. Judge Arthur Benning presided, a man in his late 50s with a face that had clearly stopped performing patience or disapproval a long time ago and simply did its job. Rask had told her Benning was not one of Crow's judges. He was not anyone's judge. He had a reputation for following the evidence where it led regardless of who was on either side of the case. Mara held on to that. The Aldridges were already seated when they arrived. Harriet Aldridge had the fixed expression of someone managing grief and indignation simultaneously. Cornelius looked at Wade when they came in, and the look was old and layered. Two men who had never liked each other, separated by the ghost of the woman they'd both loved. Wade met the look and then looked away, which Mara thought was the right choice. Whitmore had a second lawyer with him, a younger man with a briefcase. Their table was stacked with documents. Mara looked at the stack and then looked at her own satchel and thought, we'll see. The children were not in the courtroom. They were at school because Mara had decided and Wade had agreed that the children's lives should proceed as normally as possible on this day, and that their absence from school would create the very appearance of disruption that Whitmore was trying to argue existed. Rask had arranged for 4 character witnesses, Duggan, Miss Albright, Prentice, and Dorothea Crane, who was sitting in the gallery with the composed stillness of a woman who has spent 30 years listening to other people's troubles and is not easily rattled. Judge Benning opened the proceedings without ceremony. Whitmore went first. He was good, Mara had to give him that. He was controlled and precise, and he built his argument the way a good lawyer builds an argument, from the most sympathetic premise outward. He talked about the Aldridges' loss. He talked about their means and their standing and their genuine love for their grandchildren. He talked about the financial instability at Blackridge Ranch, the mortgage dispute, the foreclosure notice, the general condition of the property. He talked about the marriage, carefully calling it expedient each time he used an adjective, never fraudulent, never anything that could be directly rebutted, just that one word sitting beside the facts like a stain. He did not mention Gideon Crow. Mara noted this. She filed it. Then Rask stood up. He started with the documents. He entered the ledger-dated entries beginning the 2nd week of November. Mara's handwriting, unbroken through December and January, as evidence of consistent, detailed household management. He entered the school attendance records. He entered Miss Albright's letter, and then, because he was thorough, called Miss Albright to the stand to say in her own voice what she'd put in writing. The teacher was a small woman in her 40s with wire-rimmed glasses and the manner of someone who has spent years being underestimated and stopped being bothered by it. Whitmore asked her, on cross-examination, whether it was possible that the children's improvement at school was coincidental, that they had simply been ready to improve. Miss Albright looked at him. No, she said, it's not coincidental. Children who are ready to improve still need someone to make sure they get to school on time with enough food in them to concentrate. Cecily Mercer was performing household duties that prevented her from attending school reliably. Pearl Mercer was significantly behind in her reading. Eli Mercer was missing foundational arithmetic. She paused. These children did not improve because of coincidence. They improved because someone consistent showed up for them every single day and made it possible. Whitmore thanked her. She looked like she'd expected more resistance. Prentice was next. He was nervous on the stand. His hands on the railing were not entirely still, but he was honest, which was all Rask needed him to be. He described the welfare visit. He described what he found. He described his official finding of no basis for the complaint. And when Rask asked him carefully about the physical document on which the complaint had been filed, he said what he'd said in his statement. The stationery was from the Blackridge County Land Office, not from any party with a demonstrable concern for the children's welfare. Whitmore objected on relevance grounds. Benning overruled him. Dorothea Crane took the stand with the settled confidence of someone who knows exactly what she's there to say and why it matters. She presented her 18-month timeline. She explained her methodology, how she'd collected the information, from what sources, in what order. She was not a lawyer and didn't pretend to be, and the plainness of her account was, Mara thought, more persuasive than anything lawyerly would have been. When Rask presented the land office subpoena documents alongside Dorothea's affidavit, and the pattern became visible to the room's 6 properties, 18 months, 1 company, 1 investor, Mara watched Cornelius Aldridge's face. He hadn't known about this, or he hadn't known the extent of it. Something in his expression shifted, not guilt, exactly, but the particular discomfort of a man who has been made a tool of something uglier than he'd understood, and is now sitting in a courtroom while that fact is laid out in public. Whitmore tried hard on cross-examination. He challenged Dorothea's methodology. He challenged the inference connecting Crow's land company to the welfare complaint. He questioned whether a private citizen's records, however meticulous, constituted evidence of a coordinated scheme rather than a series of independent business decisions. Dorothea answered each challenge with the same calm precision she'd used throughout. She had the dates. She had the documents. She had the timeline. She invited Whitmore to explain the coincidences if he could. He could not. Then Rask called Duggan, who spoke for 9 minutes in the plain way of a man who chooses his words sparingly because he takes them seriously. He described what the ranch had looked like before Mara arrived. He described what it looked like now. He said, when Rask asked him to characterize the welfare of the children, they look like children. Not like survivors. There's a difference. I've seen both. Whitmore asked him on cross-examination whether he was a trained welfare professional. Duggan said no. Whitmore sat down. Duggan stepped down. The Aldridges' witnesses were a family physician from the city who testified to their financial standing and their adequate home, and a character reference who described Cornelius Aldridge as a man of integrity and community standing. Neither of them said anything about the children specifically. Rask, in cross-examination, pointed this out with the restraint of a man who doesn't need to hammer a point that is already making itself. Then it was Mara's turn. She had known she would take the stand. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, not by memorizing answers, because she couldn't know the questions, but by understanding exactly what she needed to communicate and trusting herself to find the words when the moment came. Rask walked her through the documented evidence first, the ledger, the records, the decisions she'd made and why. She answered clearly and specifically, because specificity was what documents were, and she had made her case on documents. Then Whitmore stood. He began the way she expected with the arrangement itself, the agency, the letter, the 11 weeks between her arrival and the custody petition. Mrs. Mercer, he said, with the careful courtesy of a man loading a weapon politely, you arrived at Blackridge Ranch as a mail-order bride, is that correct? I arrived through an introduction agency, yes, she said. And you married Mr. Mercer how many days after your arrival? 43 days, she said. 43 days, he repeated for the room. A man you had not previously met. Under circumstances that included a disputed mortgage and under circumstances that included 4 children who needed stability, she said. He paused. Mrs. Mercer, I'm asking the questions. Then I'd ask you to finish them, she said evenly. You said and then stopped. I want to hear the complete thought. Something in the room shifted. Not dramatically a slight adjustment. The way a room adjusts when it realizes the person on the stand is not going to make this easy. Whitmore recovered. The marriage was entered into quickly, he said, under financial pressure. You would agree with that characterization? I would agree that I married Wade Mercer 43 days after I arrived, she said. I would disagree that financial pressure was the reason. The reason was that 4 children were facing threats from multiple directions, and the legal strength of this family needed to be established clearly. She looked at him steadily. That is a decision I made with full knowledge of what I was choosing. I would make it again. You arrived as a stranger, he said. A stranger to these children. You expect the court to believe that in 43 days. I don't expect anything about belief, she said. I presented documents. The documents show what happened in this household from the day I arrived. You've seen them. The court has seen them. She paused. I'm not asking the court to believe me because I say something. I'm asking it to look at the evidence and draw the conclusion the evidence supports. Whitmore changed angles. The children's mother, he said. Clara Mercer, she grew up in a stable, prosperous household. Her children were accustomed to a certain quality of life. Do you believe you can provide that? Mara looked at him. Clara Mercer's children, she said, were running this house when I arrived. Cecily was making meals and skipping school to care for her siblings. Eli was doing ranch work before breakfast because he was afraid his father would fall apart if he didn't. Pearl had stopped talking to most people. Jasper hadn't spoken at all in 14 months. She kept her voice level. That was the quality of life they had. I changed it. The records show how. Whitmore tried several more approaches. He asked about her background, her parents, her finances, her prior circumstances. She answered each question without apology and without elaboration, giving him the fact he asked for and nothing additional, which was the right strategy with a lawyer who was fishing. He asked, finally, Mrs. Mercer, can you tell this court why these children should remain with you and their father, rather than with grandparents who loved their mother and who have the means to provide them with security? She looked at him. Then she looked briefly at Benning. Then she answered, because their mother is buried on that land, she said. Because they told me, each one of them in their own words, that they want to stay. Because Cecily is reading again, and Eli is learning his numbers, and Pearl wrote an essay that her teacher called remarkable, and Jasper has named every chicken on the property and can tell you each one's personality. She paused. And because I did not stay in that house and do that work because of a letter, or a legal arrangement, or a mortgage dispute. I stayed because I chose them, specifically, deliberately, with full knowledge of everything it would require. She looked at Whitmore without blinking. A grandparent who loved their daughter is not the same as a mother who chose her children. I am not their replacement for Clara. I am something else, someone who walked into the wreckage of their grief and decided it was worth staying for. You can call that a mail-order arrangement if you want to. I call it a family. The room was quiet. Whitmore looked at her for a moment. No further questions, he said. She stepped down. She walked back to her seat beside Wade and did not look at the Aldridges, but she was aware of Harriet Aldridge's face in her peripheral vision, and what was on it was not what she'd expected. Not hostility. Not the composed legal opposition she'd been facing all morning. Something closer to grief. The genuine kind. The kind that doesn't have a strategy. Mara sat down. Wade's hand found hers under the table brief. Just a moment, and then it was gone. But she felt it. She looked at Rask, who was already organizing his closing papers. She looked at the satchel on the table in front of them, with its documented proof of 10 weeks of daily choices, meals, and school records, and a shoulder put back and a storm of biscuits left outside a 6-year-old's door until the door opened 3 inches and a pair of brown eyes looked through. Judge Benning was making a note on the papers in front of him. The room settled into the particular quiet of a place, waiting for what comes next. Mara straightened her back and folded her hands in her lap and waited with it. Judge Benning did not rule immediately. He looked at his papers for a long moment, not the performative pause of a man who wants the room to feel the weight of the occasion, but the genuine stillness of someone working through something carefully, making sure the conclusion he'd arrived at was sitting on solid ground before he said it out loud. Mara watched his face and learned nothing from it, which she took as a good sign. A judge whose face told you things before he spoke was a judge who had already decided before he heard everything. Benning's face told her only that he was thinking. I'll take the matter under advisement, he said. I'll have a ruling by Friday. Friday was 2 days away. They filed out of the courthouse into the flat gray light of a February afternoon, and Mara stood on the steps for a moment and breathed the cold air and let the noise of the session settle out of her body. Her hands were steady. She was glad of that. Inside the courtroom she'd been steady too, but steadiness during the performance and steadiness after it are different animals, and she'd learned long ago not to confuse them. Rask came to stand beside her. You did well in there, he said. Did it help? He considered the question honestly, which she appreciated. The Crow evidence was significant, he said. Benning asked Whitmore twice to explain the land office stationery, and Whitmore didn't have an answer that satisfied him. I could see it. The welfare complaint being tied to a coordinated acquisition scheme changes the entire context of the custody petition. He paused. Whether Benning sees the Aldridges as complicit or as pawns is the question I can't answer. They may have genuinely believed they were acting in the children's interest. Harriet Aldridge's face when I finished testifying, Mara said. I saw it. She didn't know, Mara said. About Crow, about the land office, about any of it. Someone told her that her grandchildren were living in inadequate conditions, and she believed it because she wanted to believe it, because she wanted them close, because losing Clara nearly destroyed her. She looked at the street below. She's not a villain. She's a grieving woman who got used. Rask looked at her sideways. You're more generous than the situation calls for, he said. I'm accurate, she said. There's a difference. Wade came out behind them with his hat in his hands, the same posture he'd had on the day she arrived at Blackridge Ranch, the posture of a man holding something carefully, because he's not sure it'll survive being set down. He looked at Rask. 2 days, he said. 2 days, Rask confirmed. Go home. Be with your family. Let the process work. Wade looked at Mara. She picked up the satchel. Let's go home, she said. The 2 days were the hardest part. Not because anything happened during them. Nothing happened. That was precisely the difficulty. The ranch continued its ordinary requirements: cattle, water troughs, wood for the stove, meals 3 times a day. The children went to school on Thursday and came home in the afternoon and did their lessons and ate dinner and went to bed, and none of them asked directly about the hearing because they were trying not to, which was its own kind of strain. Cecily asked on Thursday night, when the younger ones were in bed, and she was helping Mara clear the supper dishes. "What do you think will happen?" she said, quietly, like she'd been holding the question all day and had run out of room for it. Mara thought about the honest answer. "I think it will go our way," she said, "but I won't tell you I'm certain, because I'm not. What I am certain of is that we presented everything true that we had, and that's all anyone can do." Cecily dried a plate. "Set it on the stack. What happens to us if it doesn't?" she said. "That's a question I'm not going to let myself answer until I have to," Mara said. "And I'd ask you to do the same." Cecily looked at her. "You do that a lot," she said. "Refuse to answer questions you don't have answers to yet. Does it bother you?" The girl thought about it with the seriousness she brought to everything. "No," she said. "Actually, it doesn't. Most adults make up answers when they don't have them. You just say you don't know." A pause. "Mama did that too." Mara looked at the window above the sink, at the dark outside. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," she said. "She was," Cecily said, simply, without the complicated grief that the topic sometimes carried. "Just the fact of it, clean and owned. She would have liked you. I think Papa was right about that." Mara didn't say anything. She took the next plate and washed it carefully, and they finished the dishes in a silence that had warmth in it, which was the best kind. Friday morning, Duggan arrived at the ranch before 7 with his wagon, and they made the drive to Callum Crossing in a cold that had no particular malice in it, just the flat, persistent chill of late February doing what late February did. Wade sat in the front with Duggan. Mara sat in the back with the satchel across her knees, watching the road unwind behind them, thinking about nothing she was going to say and everything she had already said, and whether it had been enough. She thought about the moment she'd read Wade's letter for the 3rd time at the kitchen table in Cincinnati, trying to find the thing in it that was true, not looking for anything glamorous. She'd taken that as honesty, and it had been the most useful kind, the kind that shows you what something actually is before you commit to it. She had committed to it. She didn't regret it. Even now, sitting in a wagon on a cold road, going to hear a judge decide whether the thing she'd committed to would survive intact, she didn't regret it. Whatever happened today, she had done something real. She had shown up for 4 specific children in the specific daily ways that children need to be shown up for. And those children were better for it in ways that were documented and true, and also, more importantly, were simply true regardless of any document. Jasper named his chickens. Pearl wrote essays her teacher called remarkable. Eli did arithmetic without apology. Cecily read in the morning light. Those things had happened. No ruling could unhappen them. But she wanted the ruling. She wanted it with a fierceness that surprised her even now, because she had spent weeks being strategic about this, and strategy is a cooler thing than what she felt sitting in the back of Duggan's wagon. She wanted to stay. She wanted the land and the lean-to that still angled away from the house, and the fence she hadn't finished fixing, and the kitchen with the bucket in the corner, and the rope still tied to the porch post. She wanted her family. That was what it was, finally, said plainly in her own mind on a wagon road in February, her family. Not an arrangement. Not a situation she'd entered with open eyes and practical intentions. Hers, she held on to that for the rest of the drive. The courthouse was quieter than it had been on Wednesday. The gallery had fewer people. Dorothea Crane was there again, in the same seat with the same composed stillness. Duggan took a seat beside her. Rask was already at the table when they arrived, his papers organized with the tidiness of a man who had done everything he could do and was now simply waiting. The Aldridges were there. Harriet Aldridge looked like she had not slept well. Cornelius looked like a man who had spent 2 days being angry at something. He couldn't name the particular frustrated expression of someone who has realized that the situation is not what they were. Told it was and doesn't yet know what to do with that. Whitmore was present. He nodded at Rask with the professional courtesy of opposing counsel. Rask nodded back. Mara sat down, put the satchel on the floor beside her chair, and folded her hands on the table. Judge Benning came in without fanfare and sat, and looked at his papers for a moment, and then looked at the room. "I've reviewed the complete record," he said. "I want to address several things before I give my ruling." He looked at Whitmore's table first. The petition for custody of the Mercer children was filed on the basis of 2 primary contentions, he said. First, that the father's financial instability made the home unsuitable. Second, that the recent marriage created an environment of uncertainty harmful to the children's welfare. He set down the paper he was holding. The evidence presented by the respondents addressed both contentions comprehensively. The financial records show mortgage payments current as of this month. The household records show a functioning, organized home. The school records show 4 children performing at or above expectations. The testimony of multiple witnesses corroborates all of this. He paused, however, he said, "There is a third element that I find more significant than either of the contentions in the original petition." The room was very still. "The welfare complaint," Benning said, "which formed part of the contextual argument for the petition. The argument that this was a household already under official scrutiny has been demonstrated to have originated not from a genuine concern for the children's welfare, but from stationery belonging to the Blackridge County Land Office, the same land office that had documented interest in the acquisition of the Mercer property prior to the foreclosure notice issued by Mr. Gideon Crow." He looked at the room over his papers. "The same Crow whose investment company is on record as the purchaser, through intermediaries, of 6 properties in this county over the past 18 months, properties that came available following foreclosure pressure of the same character as that applied to the Mercer Ranch." Whitmore was very still. "I am not ruling today on Mr. Crow's conduct," Benning said. "That matter has been referred to the county sheriff and is now a separate proceeding. What I am ruling on is this. The welfare complaint that formed part of the contextual foundation for the custody petition was not a genuine welfare concern. It was manufactured. And a petition for custody that rests in part on a manufactured welfare crisis cannot be sustained by this court." Cornelius Aldridge made a sound, not a word, just a sound, low and involuntary. Furthermore, Benning said, "The evidence regarding the current condition of the Mercer household is among the most thorough I have reviewed in a custody proceeding. The documentation of daily care, school attendance, medical attention, and the children's individual progress is detailed, consistent, and verifiable. The testimony of witnesses, including a trained educator, a county welfare officer, and multiple community members uniformly supports the conclusion that these children are in a stable, caring, and functioning home." He looked at Mara directly for a moment. Not with particular warmth, he was a judge, not a witness, but with the kind of directness that means a person is being seen accurately. "The petition for custody filed by Cornelius and Harriet Aldridge is denied," he said. "The 4 children, Cecily, Eli Pearl, and Jasper Mercer, remain in the custody of their father, Wade Mercer, and their stepmother, Mara Mercer. The court recognizes Blackridge Ranch as the children's established and stable home." He set down his papers. "Court is adjourned." The gavel came down. Mara sat very still for a moment. Beside her, Wade exhaled a long, controlled breath, the kind a man makes when he has been holding something in for so long that releasing it is almost painful. She felt it more than heard it. She kept her hands flat on the table because she needed them flat on something solid. Rask turned to her. "It's done," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. She did not cry. She hadn't cried since the night she read Wade's letter the 3rd time, and she didn't intend to start in a courthouse. But something in her chest was doing something that had no other category than the one she'd been avoiding for weeks. Relief. Yes, but underneath the relief, something older and quieter, the particular feeling of being in a place you are meant to be, confirmed. She picked up the satchel. Harriet Aldridge caught them on the courthouse steps. Mara saw her coming and felt Wade tense beside her, and she put her hand briefly on his arm not to stop him, just to acknowledge it. Harriet was not composed. She had clearly been crying in the brief interval since the ruling, and she had clearly decided that she was going to say something anyway, which Mara respected even if she didn't know yet what she was walking into. "Mrs. Mercer," Harriet said. She stopped 2 steps below them, looking up. She was a trim woman in city clothes with red eyes and a dignity that she was holding together through visible effort. "Mrs. Aldridge," Mara said. A pause. Cornelius was behind his wife slightly, the way a man stands when he knows the moment belongs to someone else and is trying to honor that. "I didn't know," Harriet said, "about the land, about the man Whitmore consulted with. I didn't know any of it." "I know you didn't," Mara said. Harriet looked at her. "Someone told us that the children were being neglected," she said. "Someone gave us documents. I believed them because I wanted them close. Because Clara is gone and they are all I have left of her, and She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "I was used. And my being used was used against those children. And I cannot—" Her voice broke briefly. She recovered it. "I cannot tell you how sorry I am for that." The steps were cold. The street below was empty in the way of small towns on winter mornings. Mara looked at Harriet Aldridge and saw what was there, a grandmother who had lost her daughter and tried to hold on to what remained of her, and made a terrible miscalculation in the process, helped along by a man who specialized in exploiting exactly that kind of grief. She thought about what she'd told Rask. Not a villain. A grieving woman who got used. "Mrs. Aldridge," she said. "Those children love you. They told me about the Christmas boxes. Cecily described your house to me. She's been to it. She remembers it." She paused. "I'm not interested in making you into something the children have to choose against. That's not good for them, and it's not what I want. She's met the older woman's eyes directly. What I want is for Cecily and Eli and Pearl and Jasper to have everyone who loves them still in their lives. What I'm not willing to do is let anyone interfere with where they live and who raises them. Those are two different things. Harriet was looking at her with an expression that Mara couldn't entirely read, something between recognition and gratitude, and the particular humility of someone who expected worse and received better. You'd allow them to see us, Harriet said carefully. It's not mine to allow or deny, Mara said. They're your grandchildren. But yes, summer visits if it can be arranged properly. Letters, the Christmas boxes. She looked at Cornelius now, who was watching her with the expression of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about the situation. They need their grandmother. I'm not interested in taking that from them. Cornelius Aldridge cleared his throat. We misjudged you, he said. The words came out with the effortful plainness of a proud man saying something difficult. You didn't know me, Mara said. You knew what someone told you. Those are different things. They stood on the steps for another moment, the five of them, two families that had been in opposition for months, standing in the cold February air and finding, with some awkwardness and considerable imperfection, the beginning of a different arrangement. It wasn't warmth, it wasn't forgiveness in any formal sense. It was something more practical and more honest, an acknowledgement that the children at the center of all of it deserved better than the adults around them fighting indefinitely, and a collective, halting decision to try. Duggan was waiting with the wagon. He looked at the group on the steps, and then looked carefully at the middle distance, which was the right thing to do. Mara went down the steps. Wade walked beside her. The investigation into Gideon Crow moved faster than Mara expected. Rask had filed the formal complaint with the county sheriff the week before the hearing, and the land office documents subpoenaed for the custody case had given the sheriff's office enough to open a full inquiry. By March, that inquiry had expanded to include the territorial attorney's office, and by the end of March, Crow had been formally charged with fraud, misconduct, and the illegal manufacture of a welfare complaint, through official channels, the last charge being the one that had the sharpest teeth, since it involved the corruption of a county process that was supposed to protect children. Mara heard about the charges from Rask in a letter. She read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, and then put it in the ledger, not in the evidence section, which had served its purpose and was now history, but at the back, in the section she'd started thinking of as the record of what came after. The mortgage, once Crow's legal troubles became public, was transferred by the county court to a different holder under the terms of the fraud findings. The new terms were not generous, nothing about Frontier Mortgages ever was, but they were honest, which was all Wade had ever asked for. He paid the first installment under the new terms in April, and he did it in person at the county office, and he came home that evening and stood in the kitchen doorway and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "It's done." Mara looked up from the stove. "The mortgage?" "The mortgage." He came in and sat down. He looked tired in the way he sometimes looked at the end of a day that had required something beyond physical work, the tiredness of a man who has been carrying a weight so long that setting it down takes adjustment. "It's just a payment now, not a threat, just a payment. That's all it was ever supposed to be," she said. He looked at her with the full attention he gave things when they mattered. "You did that," he said. "You found the clause. You made us go to Rask. You had the clause in your contract," she said. "You just needed someone to read it." Mara, she turned from the stove. "I'm trying to thank you," he said. "Stop deflecting." She looked at him. "All right," she said. "You're welcome." He almost laughed. Then he did laugh, a real one. Quiet but genuine, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. She hadn't heard that laugh many times. She found she wanted to hear it more. Spring came to Blackridge Ranch the way spring always came to that part of the territory, grudgingly, then all at once, like something that had been deciding and finally made up its mind. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first. The dead grass underneath was pale and flat, but within a week of sun, it began to show color again, the particular yellow-green of things that have been under pressure and are coming back. The fence line was Mara and Eli's project, started the second week of March. She had intended to do it herself, in stages, but Eli had appeared beside her on the first morning, with gloves and the post driver and the expression of someone who had decided to help and wasn't asking permission. They didn't talk much while they worked. There was a companionable silence between them that had developed over the winter. The silence of two people who were comfortable in the same space without needing to fill it. Eli was 10 going on 11, with the easy competence of a boy who had been doing physical work since he was small and had learned to do it without complaint, but who was now doing it differently, not out of fear that things would fall apart without him, but because he wanted to. That was the difference that mattered. The lean-to was Wade's project. He spent 3 weekends in April pulling it back to true and reattaching it to the main structure properly with new lumber from town and the help of Duggan, who showed up on both Saturdays without being asked, and who swung a hammer with the easy efficiency of a man who knew what he was there for. The Linta stopped angling. It sat flush against the house for the first time in what Wade estimated was 2 years. And when he came in for dinner on the second Saturday, and Mara looked out the kitchen window at the repaired wall, she felt something she could only describe as satisfaction, not pride exactly, which implies showing someone, but satisfaction, which is private and complete in itself. Pearl had started writing. Not drawing, she still drew constantly, the composition book perpetually under her arm or on the nearest flat surface, but writing too, in a separate notebook that Miss Albright had given her at the end of the school year with a note that said simply, "For Pearl, who has things to say." She showed Mara the first thing she'd written on a Sunday afternoon in May, sitting beside her on the porch bench with the notebook in her lap. She didn't say anything, just put the notebook in Mara's hands and looked at the yard. It was a short piece, 2 paragraphs about her mother, about the specific way Clara Mercer had laughed, about her hands, about one particular afternoon when Pearl had been sick with a fever, and her mother had sat beside her all night and told her made-up stories about horses that talked, and Pearl had known even then, as a small sick child, that the stories were being made up in real time, which made them better somehow, not worse. Mara read it twice. "This is very good, Pearl," she said. Pearl said without vanity. "Just accuracy. I want to write about her so I don't forget the small things. The big things are easy to remember. It's the small things that go first." Mara looked at her, this 8-year-old girl, with her mother's eye for detail, and her father's precision, and her own particular quality of emotional intelligence that went deeper than her years warranted. "Then write all of it," Mara said, "everything you remember. Write it down. Will you read it?" Pearl said. "Every word," Mara said. "If you want me to?" "I want you to," Pearl said. She took the notebook back with the care of someone returning something valuable. "You knew her differently than we did. You didn't know her at all, actually. That might make you a better reader." Mara thought about that. "Maybe," she said. "Or it might just mean I'll ask you questions." "That's fine," Pearl said. "I like questions." Cecily turned 15 in June. She had a party, the first birthday party anyone in that house had celebrated properly since before Clara died, because the 2 birthdays in between had been the kind that people acknowledge but don't observe. The quiet acknowledgement of people still too close to grief to add joy to it without it feeling wrong. This one was different. Mara had asked her, 2 weeks before, what she wanted, and Cecily had said after a pause that suggested she hadn't been asked, that in some time that she wanted cake, specifically the kind with the lemon filling, and she wanted to invite 2 girls from school who she had recently started spending time with. Both girls came. The cake had lemon filling. Cecily wore a dress that had been Mara's project for the 3 weeks prior, new fabric from town, cut to fit properly, not handed down, not repurposed, just hers. When she came downstairs in it on the morning of her birthday, she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with the expression of someone who is not sure they deserve the thing they're looking at, and then squared her shoulders and walked in like she'd decided she did. Mara watched her from the stove and said nothing, because the moment didn't need commentary. It just needed to happen. Wade gave Cecily a book, a real one, not a school primer, a novel, one she'd mentioned once in passing 2 months ago that she wanted to read, and he had remembered and gone to town for it, which told Mara something specific and important about the kind of father he was underneath, all the grief and pressure that had buried him. He had been listening, even in the worst of it. He had been paying attention. It had just been covered over like the grass under snow still there, waiting for the conditions to let it show. Jasper gave Cecily a drawing he'd done himself, not Pearl's quality. Jasper had no particular talent for drawing, but he had drawn Cecily and himself and Hazel the chicken all together in front of the barn, the 3 of them in a line, and he'd written at the top in his careful 6-year-old letters, "Happy birthday, Sissy." Cecily looked at it for a long time. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her new dress. Dorothea Crane came out to the ranch in July. She came to see how things had turned out. That was what she said. In the practical way, she said everything, without sentimentality but with genuine interest. She stayed 2 nights and she and Mara talked for long hours in the evenings, on the porch, while the summer dark came in slow and the children's voices carried from the yard. They talked about Crow's case, which was progressing through the courts and would likely end in a significant judgment against him. They talked about the other 5 families, 3 of whom, emboldened by what had happened to Crow's scheme, had engaged lawyers of their own regarding the circumstances of their property sales. "You started something," Dorothea said. "I was trying to save one ranch," Mara said. "And you did that too," Dorothea said. "But when you pull one thread and the whole thing unravels," she shrugged. "That's not your fault or your credit. That's just what happens when someone decides to look at the whole picture instead of just their own corner." Mara thought about that. "I kept records," she said. "That's all." I kept records because I understood that what was real needed to be provable. Most people understand that things are real, Dorothea said. Not everyone understands the difference between real and provable. She looked at her. You do, that's not nothing. They sat on the porch in the warm July evening, and Mara thought about the boarding house in Cincinnati, about the $12.40, about the letter she'd read 3 times and the decision she'd made that wasn't really a decision so much as a recognition. This is the direction. You already know it. Stop deliberating and go. She had gone. She looked at the yard where Jasper was explaining something to Hazel with great seriousness, gesturing in the way he did when he was making a particularly important point. Hazel regarded him with the serene attention of a hen who has decided this person is acceptable and intends to stay near him. Pearl was drawing on the flat rock near the fence, her composition book open, her pencil moving with the absorbed intensity of someone who is elsewhere and everywhere at once. Eli was somewhere in the barn, she could hear, distantly, the sounds of him doing something that involved a great deal of effort and no apparent help, which was very like him. Cecily came out the back door with 2 glasses of water and handed one to Mara and one to Dorothea, and sat on the porch steps with her own and her book, and in 5 seconds was gone into it, in the way she went into books completely, with no part of her remaining on the surface. It's a good life, Dorothea said quietly. It's a real life, Mara said. There was a difference. She'd learned that here, specifically in the months since November. A good life was something you could describe from the outside. A real life was something you were in the middle of, with all its difficulty and uncertainty and imperfection, and that you chose to stay in because the staying mattered more than the ease of going. She had chosen to stay every day. She kept choosing it. Wade found her one evening in late July standing at the kitchen window, looking at nothing in particular, the yard, the fence line, the sky doing something complicated in the west. He came to stand beside her, which was a thing he did sometimes, just stood close enough that she was aware of him without it requiring anything. After a while, he said, "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about the letter," she said. "The first one that you wrote." He was quiet for a moment. "What about it?" "You said you weren't looking for anything glamorous," she said. "I thought that was honesty." "I took it as honesty." She looked out at the yard. It was the truest thing in the letter. "Nothing about this is glamorous." "No," he said. "The fence still needs work in the north section," she said. "The cold cellar has a moisture problem I haven't solved. Eli went through the knee of his good trousers last week, and I have to patch them before Sunday." She paused. "Jasper has decided that Hazel needs a companion and is making a very thorough argument for a second chicken." Wade made the almost law sound. "He's making a written argument," he said. "He showed me the draft." "He showed me the draft too," she said. "He's showing everyone the draft." They stood at the window for a moment more. "Mara," he said. She turned. He was looking at her in the way he had started to look at her more often. In the past months, the full look. The one with nothing managed or held back. The one that had taken the whole winter to arrive at, and was still a new enough thing that she felt it each time. "I know this wasn't what you imagined," he said. "When you read that letter." "No," she said, as he stopped, chose his words. "Are you—" "Yes," she said, before he finished. Because she knew what he was asking, and the answer was yes, clearly and specifically and without qualification. He looked at her. "I didn't think it would—" He stopped again. The man was not a talker, had never been, and she had stopped expecting him to say the complex things cleanly. He felt them clearly. The expression of them was the part that came slow. "I know," she said. He reached over and took her hand, not the brief under-the-table contact of the courthouse, but properly her hand in both of his, the way you hold something you intend to keep. They stood at the kitchen window, and the sky did what July skies do in the northern territories, went orange, then deep red, then the particular blue that comes just before dark, the blue that makes everything it falls on look like a version of itself worth keeping. Outside, Jasper was still talking to Hazel. Pearl's pencil was still moving. Cecily had looked up from her book to watch the sky. Eli came out of the barn and stood in the yard for a moment, squinting up at the colors, and Mara could see on his face what she recognized as contentment, not happiness exactly, which is loud and brief, but the quieter thing underneath it, the thing that says this is where I am, and where I am is all right. She had done that, partially, imperfectly, alongside a man who was still finding his way back from grief, and 4 children who had been trying to survive, and a community of people who had quietly been watching and waiting, and who had, when the moment came, shown up. She had not done it alone, but she had started it. She had walked through the door with $12.40 in a battered trunk, and the decision, not yet fully formed, to stay, and she had stayed, and kept staying, and the staying had made this. There is a thing that people misunderstand about courage, which is that they imagine it as the large dramatic moment, the decision made in a flash, the line held under pressure, the testimony given in a courtroom. Those things are part of it. But the larger part of courage The part that actually builds anything is the daily version. The version that doesn't look like courage from the outside because it looks like an ordinary morning. Getting up, starting the stove, making the oatmeal, sitting in a hallway outside a closed door, doing mending, waiting for a small child to decide you were worth opening to, doing it again the next day, and the next. That is the thing that Mara Whitlock had brought to Blackridge Ranch, not strategy, not legal preparation, not the ability to read a contract clause, though all of those had mattered. What she'd brought underneath all of it was the daily decision. The willingness to show up for this specific imperfect struggling family, not because it was easy or guaranteed or because anyone had told her it would work out, but because she had looked at it honestly and decided it was worth the showing up. She had been right, not in the way that stories sometimes make things right clean and resolved and without remainder. The fence still needed work in the north section. The cold cellar still had its moisture problem. Jasper's argument for a second chicken was frankly going to win, and then there would be 2 chickens to name and keep track of and explain to guests. There were hard winters ahead and tight months, and the ordinary disasters that land brings animals lost, crops uncertain, weather with no particular regard for human plans. But the family was intact. The land was theirs. The children were in their beds in the house where their mother was buried within sight of the window, and the woman who had come to be their stepmother had made herself something none of them had expected, and all of them had needed, not a replacement for what they'd lost, but something that could only be itself. A person who had chosen them when she didn't have to, who had stayed when leaving would have been easier, who had fought for them with records and testimony and a dislocated shoulder put back in the dark during a storm, and who had done all of it not for recognition or reward, but because she had looked at 4 children trying to survive and decided, simply and without fanfare, that they deserved better. They had deserved it. They had gotten it. And Mara, who had arrived in November with almost nothing, who had sat in a stranger's kitchen and looked at a stranger's children and felt the particular recognition of someone finding a thing they didn't know they'd been looking for, had gotten something too. Not what she'd imagined when she read the letter. Something more difficult and more real and more entirely hers. A home that had needed her. A family that had chosen her back. She stood at the kitchen window with Wade's hands around hers and the July sky going dark outside, and she felt the weight of all of it not as a burden, but as a presence. The weight of something real. She had come here as a mail-order bride with a letter and a trunk and almost nothing else. She stayed as something that had no category in any agency's ledger, something that could only be called simply and completely home.